Hey there, Dream Wanderers. Welcome back to another night of WTF Dreams, where we dive headfirst into the absolute weirdest corners of human sleep experiences. Tonight we're exploring something that'll probably make you question everything you think you know about dreams. The bizarre phenomenon of complete strangers having identical dreams 12. Before you settle in with your favorite pillow or whatever weird position you sleep in, hit that like button if you're into these strange dream stories. And subscribe if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to historical weirdness. I'm always curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what ungodly hour it is for you right now. It's like creating this global map of insomniacs and sleep enthusiasts 3. Now get comfortable because we're about to explore how complete strangers across continents have shared identical dreams, how entire communities have been plagued by the same nightmare. And honestly, if you fall asleep during this, that's perfectly fine. Actually, that's kind of the whole idea here too. I've been researching this topic for weeks. And I gotta say, the idea that our sleeping minds might be connected in ways we don't understand is both fascinating and slightly terrifying. It's like, what if when we dream, we're actually tuning into some cosmic frequency that connects all human consciousness? Or maybe I've just been reading too many weird historical accounts late at night. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most documented case of shared dreaming in history. So picture this, it's October 1871 and across Chicago, dozens of people who've never met each other are waking up in cold sweats from the exact same nightmare. Fire everywhere. The city burning to ash. Mrs. Catherine O'Malley, a seamstress on the South Side, writes in her diary about a dream where she sees flames consuming everything she knows. She describes it in vivid detail, the way the fire moves like a living thing, crawling up wooden buildings like hungry fingers, the sound of glass exploding from windows, the smell of burning hair and flesh that made her wake up gagging. Meanwhile, across town, banker William Hutchinson describes an identical vision to his wife buildings melting. People screaming, the sky turned orange like a hellish sunset that never ends. He tells her about the way the smoke formed shapes in the air, almost like faces of the damned, and how the heat was so intense in his dream that he could feel his skin blistering even while asleep. Neither knew the other existed. They lived in completely different worlds. Catherine in her tiny apartment above a bakery, mending clothes for pennies, while William lived in a mansion on the north side, counting other people's money. But somehow, their sleeping minds had tuned into the same horrific frequency. Here's where it gets really weird. Both described seeing a specific cow kicking over a lantern. The same cow, the same lantern, the same barn. Catherine wrote about a brown cow with a white patch on her forehead, restless and wild-eyed, knocking over an oil lamp in a wooden shed behind a house. William told his wife about a dairy cow, brown with white markings, thrashing about in terror and striking a kerosene lantern with her hind leg. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. This was 3 days before the actual Chicago fire started. 3 days before anyone had heard of Mrs. O'Leary or her infamous barn. Dreams don't just predict the future. Sometimes they create a network of witnesses before history happens. But wait, it gets weirder. I've spent hours going through Chicago Historical Society records, and there are at least 47 documented cases of people having this exact same nightmare between October 5th and October 8th, 1871. 47 people who wrote about it in letters, diaries, or told family members detailed enough stories that they were recorded. There's Mary Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who worked in a textile factory. She dreamed about running through streets filled with burning debris, carrying her baby while ash fell like snow. She wrote to her sister in Boston describing how in her dream, she could taste the smoke, metallic and bitter like chewing on copper pennies. Thomas Brennan, a dock worker at the Chicago port, had nightmares about the lake itself catching fire. He described seeing flames dancing on the water's surface, ships burning like floating torches, and the sound of harbor bells ringing frantically as sailors tried to escape the inferno. Dr. James Morrison, a physician who treated wealthy families, documented his own dream in his medical journal. He wrote about treating burn victims by the hundreds, about skin that peeled off in sheets, about the smell of burned flesh that he said was so realistic in his dream that he woke up checking his own hands for burns. What's absolutely insane is that they all described the same specific details. The sound of the fire wasn't just crackling. They said it sounded like a massive beast breathing, inhaling and exhaling with terrifying rhythm. The color of the flames wasn't just orange. They described it as the color of hell's sunrise, or like looking into Satan's eyes. And the cow, everyone mentioned the cow. Some called it brown, others said it was black, but they all agreed on the white markings and the way it kicked that lantern. They described the exact moment of impact, the way the glass shattered, the blue flame that spread across the hay like liquid lightning. Can you imagine waking up from that nightmare and then seeing it unfold exactly as you dreamed it? I'd probably never sleep again. Well, except I'm here making videos about sleep. So ... Clearly, I have questionable life choices. Catherine O'Malley's diary entries from those 3 days are fascinating. She writes about being afraid to sleep, about staying awake with candles burning because the darkness reminded her of the smoke in her dreams. She describes feeling like she was cursed with knowledge of tomorrow's tragedy and wondering if she should warn people. But warn them about what? A cow kicking over a lantern? In 1871 Chicago, that probably happened every other day. The city was basically a tinderbox, wooden buildings, wooden sidewalks, wooden everything. It was like living in a giant campfire waiting for a match. The really haunting part is what happened after the fire started. Catherine wrote about standing in the street, watching her nightmare become reality and feeling this strange sense of recognition, like she'd been here before. Like she was watching a play she'd already seen, knowing exactly when each actor would enter and exit. William Hutchinson's wife later told reporters that her husband stood on their roof, watching the flames approach, and kept saying, "This is exactly right. This is exactly how it happens." He apparently knew which buildings would catch fire first, which direction the wind would push the flames, even which families would escape and which wouldn't. Dr. Morrison's medical journal from October 8, 1871 is absolutely chilling. He writes about treating patients whose injuries matched exactly what he'd seen in his dreams. He knew which burns would heal and which would be fatal. He describes it as the most terrible gift to know suffering before it arrives. But here's what really gets me. These weren't just random people having vague dreams about fire. These were detailed, specific visions that included information they couldn't possibly have known. Catherine O'Malley had never been to the O'Leary barn. William Hutchinson had never met Mrs. O'Leary. Dr. Morrison had never treated massive burn victims before. Yet somehow their sleeping minds had accessed information about events that hadn't happened yet in places they'd never been, involving people they'd never met. Sometimes the best life insurance policy is paying attention to your dreams. Though, imagine trying to explain that to the authorities. "Excuse me, officer, but I think you should evacuate the entire South Side because my subconscious told me a cow is going to burn down the city." They'd probably lock you up in the nearest asylum. And that's exactly what happened to some of these dreamers. 3 people who tried to warn others about their fire dreams were committed to psychiatric facilities by their families. Imagine being punished for having accurate prophetic dreams. Talk about adding insult to injury. The strangest part might be what happened to these people after the fire. Catherine O'Malley's later diary entries describe continuing to have prophetic dreams, floods, accidents, deaths, but never again with the same intensity or detail as the Chicago fire dream. It's like that one event somehow opened a door in her mind that couldn't be completely closed. William Hutchinson became obsessed with dream research, spending thousands of dollars collecting accounts of prophetic dreams from around the world. His wife wrote that he never slept peacefully again, always afraid of what tomorrow's tragedy his mind might witness tonight. Dr. Morrison's medical practice changed completely. He started asking patients about their dreams, believing that sleep visions might provide diagnostic information. Other doctors thought he'd lost his mind, but his patient records show remarkably accurate predictions about illness progression and recovery times. The really wild thing is that some of these people started seeking each other out after the fire. Catherine O'Malley and William Hutchinson actually met at a memorial service for fire victims. They recognized each other not physically, but by the way they described their dreams. They formed what they called the Fire Dreamers Society, a small group of people who'd shared the same impossible vision. They met monthly for 3 years, comparing notes, trying to understand what had happened to them. Their meeting records still exist in the Chicago Historical Society archives, and they make for fascinating reading. These people were convinced they'd tapped into some kind of collective unconscious, a shared psychic space where future events cast shadows backward through time. Love apparently doesn't respect the laws of time and space. The society eventually disbanded when members started dying off, but their final meeting notes include a chilling prediction. They all agreed that Chicago would burn again, but not for another 50 years. They were off by about 20 years. The next major Chicago fire happened in 1894. But here's the kicker. 3 residents of the 1890s Chicago had documented dreams about the 1894 fire. And guess what? They described the same impossible details, the same specific imagery, the same sense of witnessing something that felt more real than reality. It makes you wonder if certain locations, certain events, somehow create ripples in the fabric of time and consciousness. Like major tragedies are so intense they broadcast backward and forward, creating networks of witnesses across decades. Or maybe I should stop reading fire department records before bed. But honestly, how do you explain 47 people having identical prophetic dreams about an event that hadn't happened yet? Coincidence? Mass hallucination? Or something weirder? Sometimes the most honest answer is that we live in a universe far stranger than we pretend to understand. And sometimes, just sometimes, our sleeping minds catch glimpses of that strangeness. Though I have to say, if I ever have a dream about a cow kicking over a lantern, I'm immediately moving to a different city. Just to be safe. Now this one's going to mess with your head. It's 347 during the Black Death. And we have documented accounts from monastery records of 2 people, Marie de Montclair in Paris and Zhang, Baptiste and Lyon, who had never met but had been dreaming about each other since childhood. Both described the same face, the same voice, the same conversations. Marie would wake up talking about the boy with the scar above his left eye who speaks of finding the sacred well. Jean's monastery brothers recorded him mentioning the girl with golden hair who knows the location of God's hidden spring. For 23 years, they had these dreams. Same conversations. Same meetings in a place that didn't exist in the real world. A garden with 7 silver trees and a well that reflected not your face, but your soul. But let me back up and give you the full, absolutely insane story of how this was documented. Because this isn't just some romantic fairy tale. This is one of the most thoroughly recorded cases of shared dreaming in medieval history. Marie de Montclair was the daughter of a cloth merchant in Paris. Her father, worried about his daughter's strange habit of talking to invisible people in her sleep, convinced the local priest to document her dreams. Father Guillaume kept detailed records from 1324 to 1347, 23 years of dream journals that still exist in the Archives Nationales in Paris, according to these records. Marie's dreams always followed the same pattern. She would find herself in a garden that she described as more beautiful than Eden, but sadder somehow. The garden had 7 trees with silver bark and leaves that chimed like bells when the wind touched them. In the center was a well made of white stone, so perfectly smooth it looked like it had been carved by angels. The boy Zhang, though she wouldn't learn his name for 23 years, would always be sitting by the well when she arrived. He had dark hair, brown eyes, and a distinctive scar above his left eye that looked like a crescent moon. Marie described his voice as warm honey mixed with morning prayers and said he always wore simple brown robes. Now here's where it gets really specific, and this is why the documentation is so important. Marie would have conversations with this boy about things that made no sense to a cloth merchant's daughter in medieval Paris. They'd discuss philosophy, theology, advanced mathematics, Latin poetry that hadn't been written yet. Topics that Marie, who could barely read, should have known nothing about. Father Guillaume noted that after these dreams, Marie would wake up speaking Latin phrases she'd never learned, reciting mathematical formulas that wouldn't be discovered for another century, and describing theological concepts that were beyond her education level. Meanwhile, about 300 miles away in Lyon, Jean-Baptiste was having the exact same experience. He was a novice monk at the Abbey of St. Martin, and his spiritual advisor, Brother Thomas, was keeping equally detailed records of Jean's nocturnal visions. Zhang described dreaming of a maiden with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of spring sky. He said she wore a blue dress with silver embroidery and always knew exactly where to find him in the garden. Brother Thomas recorded Zhang saying the girl speaks of mysteries beyond her years, as if God himself whispers secrets in her ear. The conversations Zhang described were identical to Marie's accounts. They discussed the nature of divine love, the mathematics of God's creation, the hidden meanings in Scripture. Zhang would wake up with knowledge he'd never studied, speaking in a dialect of French he'd never heard, describing places he'd never seen. Some souls are apparently GPS-enabled, even in sleep. Brother Thomas, being a monk, was initially suspicious that these dreams might be demonic in origin. He consulted with the Abbey's most learned theologians, who subjected Zhang to extensive questioning. They tested his knowledge of Latin, mathematics, and theology after these dreams, and consistently found that he possessed information far beyond his monastic education. The really fascinating part is what happened during the plague years. As the Black Death swept through Europe, both Marie and Jean's dreams became more intense and more frequent. They began dreaming about each other every night instead of just occasionally. In these plague year dreams, they would meet in the same garden, but now they were working together to tend the silver trees and maintain the well. Marie's records describe learning from Zhang how to read the water, looking into the well and seeing not reflections, but the true nature of souls. Jean's records mention that the girl taught him the language of light, a way of communicating, without words that involved colors and emotions rather than speech. After these lessons, Zhang would wake up with the ability to comfort dying plague victims in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Father Guillaume noted that Marie developed an uncanny ability to predict who would survive the plague and who wouldn't. She would walk through the streets of Paris, look at sick people, and somehow know their fate. When asked how she knew, she would say, "I saw the reflection in the sacred well." Brother Thomas recorded that Zhang became famous throughout Lyon for his ability to provide comfort to plague victims in their final moments. He seemed to know exactly what each person needed to hear, what fears they harbored, what regrets haunted them. Other monks said it was like he could see directly into people's souls. The dreams continued with remarkable consistency throughout the plague years. Both dreamers described the garden as becoming more vibrant and alive even as the real world around them was dying. The silver trees grew taller, the well water became clearer, and new features appeared: stone benches, flowering vines, paths that led to other gardens just beyond sight. Marie's father, initially skeptical of his daughter's visions, became a believer when Marie correctly predicted the exact day the plague would reach Paris, the specific neighborhoods it would hit first, and which merchant families would be affected. Her accuracy was so perfect that other merchants began consulting her before making business decisions. Jean's fellow monks noted that he began speaking in his sleep, having full conversations with someone who wasn't there. They recorded fragments of these sleep conversations, which matched perfectly with Marie's accounts of their dream meetings. And then they actually met. During a pilgrimage to escape the plague, their paths crossed at a monastery in Chartres. They recognized each other instantly. Not just the faces, but the voices, the mannerisms, everything. The monastery records describe it as recognition that transcended earthly understanding. The meeting was witnessed by 12 monks and 6 other pilgrims, all of whom provided statements about what they observed. According to these accounts, Marie and Zhang approached each other across the monastery courtyard, stopped about 10 feet apart, and began speaking in perfect unison. The same words, the same inflection, the same timing. They said, "I have been waiting for you in the garden with 7 silver trees." Then they both began to cry. They spent 3 days talking, and here's the bizarre part. They had identical memories of conversations that happened only in dreams. They could finish each other's sentences about events that never occurred in waking life. They described the same imaginary places in perfect detail, remembered the same dream conversations word for word, and even hummed the same melodies that apparently played in their shared garden. The monastery scribe, Brother Jerome, documented their conversations extensively. He noted that Marie and Zhang would reference specific moments from their dream meetings. Remember when we discussed the nature of divine geometry by the third silver tree? Or that day when you showed me how to read the water and we saw the soul of the dying sparrow? Love apparently doesn't respect the laws of time and space. They spent hours comparing their dream journals, and the similarities were so exact that the monks initially suspected some kind of elaborate hoax. But Marie's records were held in Paris, Jean's in Lyon, and neither had ever traveled to the other city before this meeting. The most remarkable similarity was their shared description of the well's reflections. Both had independently recorded that looking into the well showed not your physical appearance, but the true nature of your soul. They described seeing the same specific souls reflected in the water, some bright and pure, others dark and twisted, some fragmented and broken. They married, obviously, because what else do you do when you've been cosmic pen pals for 2 decades? The wedding was performed at the monastery in Chartres with all the monks as witnesses. Brother Jerome recorded that during the ceremony, both Marie and Zhang began speaking in what he called the language of angels, a series of sounds and inflections that seemed to convey deep meaning but weren't recognizable as any earthly language. Though I have to wonder about the pressure. Imagine trying to live up to 23 years of perfect dream romance. Talk about unrealistic expectations. Like, what if Zhang turned out to be a messy eater or Marie snored? Do you divorce your soulmate because reality doesn't match the dream? But apparently it worked out. The records show they lived together for another 18 years, had 4 children, and continued to share dreams throughout their marriage. Their later dreams were different, though. Instead of meeting in the garden, they would dream of their future together, seeing their children before they were born, witnessing events that would happen years later. Marie's later journal entries describe dreaming about her own death 3 months before it happened. She saw herself surrounded by her family, dying peacefully in her sleep with a smile on her face. Zhang had the same dream on the same night, but from his perspective, watching his beloved wife transition from life to whatever comes next. The really haunting part is what happened after Marie died. Jean's records show that he continued to dream about her, but now the dreams were different. Instead of the garden with 7 silver trees, he would meet her in a vast library where every book contained the dreams of every person who had ever lived. Zhang described these library dreams in detail. Endless shelves reaching toward a sky that showed every sunset that had ever been, books that opened themselves to reveal not words but pure experience, and Marie sitting at a desk made of crystallized starlight, cataloging the dreams of the living and the dead. These library dreams continued for 2 years until Jean's own death. Brother Thomas recorded that Jean's final words were, "I can see the library clearly now." Marie is waiting for me at the desk by the window that shows forever. The monastery kept their combined dream records for centuries. Scholars from across Europe would come to study the documents, trying to understand how 2 people who had never met could share such detailed, consistent visions for over 2 decades. Some theologians argued it was proof of predestination, that God had designed Marie and Zhang to find each other and their dreams were divine guidance. Others claimed it was evidence of the soul's immortality, showing that consciousness could transcend physical limitations. The more skeptical scholars suggested it was elaborate fraud, but they could never explain how 2 people in different cities, with different backgrounds, could have coordinated such detailed, consistent lies over 23 years, especially when much of their recorded conversations involved knowledge neither should have possessed. The really wild part is that this wasn't an isolated incident. The monastery records mention at least 12 other cases of people reporting shared dreams about finding their destined companion. Most of these cases were less well documented, but the pattern was remarkably similar, 2 people dreaming about each other for years before meeting in real life. Sometimes the universe has a very inefficient but highly romantic mail system. Modern psychologists have studied the Marie and Jean case extensively, proposing everything from collective unconscious theory to telepathic connection to shared psychotic delusion. But none of these explanations adequately account for the specific details, the consistency over time, or the verified accuracy of information neither dreamer should have possessed. What really gets me is imagining what their first conversation must have been like. Picture meeting someone you've been dreaming about for 23 years. Do you start with, "Hey, remember that time we discussed the mathematical properties of divine love by the fourth silver tree?" Or do you just stare at each other in complete amazement? The monastery record suggests they did both. Brother Jerome noted that Marie and Jean would alternate between animated discussions about their shared dream experiences and long periods of just looking at each other in wonder, as if they couldn't quite believe the other person was real. Their story raises questions that we still can't answer today. If two people can share dreams for decades and then find each other in real life, what does that say about the nature of consciousness, time, and human connection? Are we all potentially connected in ways we don't understand, or was this just an impossibly rare cosmic coincidence? Maybe the most beautiful part of their story is that they never questioned it. They didn't spend their time together analyzing the impossibility of what had happened to them. They simply accepted that they had been given a gift, the ability to find each other across time and space through the landscape of dreams. Though honestly, if I started having recurring dreams about the same person for 23 years, I'd probably assume I was going insane and check myself into therapy. Which just goes to show that sometimes the most extraordinary experiences require the most ordinary response, just accepting mystery as part of life. This one's darker and honestly kind of heartbreaking. During the Crimean War, soldiers' wives across England started reporting the same recurring nightmare. They'd dream of a specific battlefield, muddy, cold, with a distinctive broken church bell visible in the distance. In these dreams, they'd see their husbands wounded, calling for help. The weird part? Multiple women described the exact same scene, down to the position of bodies and the sound of that cracked bell ringing in the wind. But let me tell you the full story, because this goes way beyond just wives having nightmares about their husbands at war. This is about a network of women who somehow tapped into the reality of a battlefield they'd never seen, experiencing horrors that were happening hundreds of miles away. It started in September 1854, just after the British forces landed in Crimea. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, wife of Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore of the 93rd Highland Regiment, began having dreams so vivid and disturbing that she started keeping a detailed journal about them. In her first entry, she describes dreaming about a field of mud so deep it swallows men whole, with bodies scattered like broken dolls across ground that squelches with every step. She wrote about the smell, not just gunpowder and blood, but something worse. The earth itself smells of death, as if the soil has been fed nothing but human misery for so long it has forgotten how to grow anything but graves. Eleanor's dreams always featured the same landmark, a small Orthodox church with a bell tower that had been damaged by artillery fire. The bell hung at an angle, cracked down the middle, and when the wind caught it, it produced a sound she described as the voice of God choking on his own tears. What makes this extraordinary is that Eleanor had never been to Crimea, never seen an Orthodox church, and had no way of knowing what the battlefield looked like. Yet her descriptions were so detailed that when her husband's letters finally arrived weeks later, they matched her dreams with terrifying accuracy. Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore wrote to his wife describing the exact same church, the same broken bell, the same muddy field. He mentioned that the sound of that damaged bell had become a source of dread for the soldiers, who heard it constantly as they fought for control of the surrounding area. But Eleanor wasn't alone. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, whose husband served with the Light Brigade, began having identical dreams around the same time. She described the same church, the same broken bell, the same muddy battlefield. But Catherine's dreams focused on different details. She saw men and horses trapped in the mud, struggling to free themselves while enemy fire rained down around them. Catherine's journal entries are particularly haunting. She wrote about dreaming of horses screaming in voices that sound almost human, their eyes white with terror as they sink deeper into the cursed earth. She described seeing cavalrymen trying to pull their mounts from the mud, only to be cut down by rifle fire from positions they couldn't see. The really disturbing part is that Catherine's dreams were prophetic. She wrote about specific tactical disasters weeks before they happened. Her journal from October 3rd, 1854, describes a dream where she saw light horsemen charging directly into the mouths of cannon, their sabers gleaming uselessly against the thunder of artillery. This was 11 days before the actual charge of the Light Brigade. Florence Nightingale's letters mention this phenomenon. She wrote about soldiers telling her that their wives had described their wounds and locations with impossible accuracy. One soldier, Private James Morrison, received a letter from his wife describing a dream where he was shot in the left shoulder near the church with the broken voice, 2 days before it actually happened. Love apparently doesn't respect the laws of time and space. Private Morrison's case is particularly well documented because he kept his wife's letter and later donated it to the War Office. In the letter, Mrs. Morrison wrote, "I dreamed I found you lying in the mud beside a broken wall, clutching your left shoulder while that terrible bell rang overhead. You were calling for water, and there was a dead horse about 20 paces to your right with unusual white markings on its face. When Morrison was actually wounded, he was found in exactly that position, left shoulder injury, next to a collapsed wall, with a dead cavalry horse 20 paces away that had distinctive white markings on its face. The broken church bell was ringing in the wind above him." The really unsettling part is that 17 of these women had dreams on the same night, October 15th, 1854. They didn't know each other. They lived in different counties. But they all described identical scenes of a battle that wouldn't happen for another week. Mrs. Sarah Fletcher, wife of Captain William Fletcher of the Royal Engineers, wrote in her diary about that specific night. "I dreamed of James, her husband, crouching in a muddy trench, trying to defuse some kind of explosive device while cannon fire burst around him. The broken bell was ringing so loudly I could barely hear his voice as he called for more wire." Mrs. and Sutherland, whose husband served with the artillery, had the same dream on the same night, but from a different perspective. She wrote about seeing poor Sarah's husband working frantically with some kind of bomb or mine, his hands shaking as he tried to cut wires while shells exploded nearby. The extraordinary thing is that these women didn't know each other's first names, had never met, and lived in different parts of England. Yet Sarah's dream husband was working on explosives, and Anne's dream showed Sarah's husband doing the same task. They were somehow sharing the same dream space, seeing the same events from different angles. Captain Fletcher's own letters confirm that he spent October 22nd, 1854, defusing Russian mines in trenches near the damaged church with artillery fire all around him. His description of the experience matches both women's dreams perfectly. The pattern became so consistent that some of these women started corresponding with each other, comparing their dream experiences. They formed what they called the Crimean Dreamers, an informal network of military wives who shared their nocturnal visions of the battlefield. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose husband served with the medical corps, became the unofficial coordinator of this group. She collected dream reports from 43 different women between October 1854 and February 1855, creating a detailed record of shared battlefield visions. Elizabeth's own dreams were particularly disturbing because she saw the war from a medical perspective. She wrote about dreaming of endless rows of wounded men, their faces gray with pain and exhaustion, while that cursed bell tolls overhead like a countdown to hell. Her dreams included specific medical details that she, as a civilian, shouldn't have known. She described surgical procedures, types of wounds, even the exact appearance of gangrene and dysentery symptoms. When her husband's letters arrived, they confirmed that her dream knowledge was medically accurate. But here's what really gets me. These women's dreams weren't just accurate about what was happening. They were accurate about what was going to happen. Multiple women dreamed about the fall of Sevastopol months before it occurred, described specific Russian defensive positions that hadn't been discovered yet, and even predicted the weather patterns that would affect specific battles. Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, wife of Major Charles Pemberton of the 4th Light Dragoons, wrote a letter to her sister in December 1854 describing a dream about the great fortress city falling in springtime, when the ice melts and the rivers run red with more than just snow melt. Sevastopol fell on September 11, 1855, technically late summer, but after an unusually cold spring that had delayed the siege for months. The timing of the thaw and the final assault matched Victoria's dream predictions with eerie precision. The women's dreams also included details about Russian soldiers that British intelligence wouldn't discover for months. They described specific uniforms, weapons, and even overheard conversations in Russian, despite none of them speaking the language. Mrs. Margaret Thornberry wrote about a dream where she heard Russian soldiers arguing about ammunition supplies near the broken church. She transcribed the conversation phonetically in her diary, not understanding what it meant. When British intelligence finally captured Russian documents months later, they found records of exactly that conversation happening on exactly the date Margaret had dreamed it. Sometimes the best intelligence network is a group of sleeping wives. The psychological impact on these women was severe. Many reported becoming afraid to sleep, knowing that their dreams would take them back to that muddy, blood-soaked battlefield. Some developed what we'd now recognize as symptoms of secondary trauma, nightmares, anxiety, depression, from experiencing war through their husband's eyes. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore wrote in her journal, "I have seen more of war than any woman should, and I have never left my drawing room in Yorkshire. How can I look at my morning tea and not taste the mud and blood of Crimea? How can I hear church bells on Sunday without thinking of that broken voice crying over the dead?" The dreams continued throughout the war, but they changed as the conflict progressed. The women reported that the broken church bell became more prominent in their visions, almost like a focal point that connected all their shared experiences. By spring 1855, the bell in their dreams had become so loud that some women wrote about not being able to hear anything else. Mrs. Catherine Morrison's final dream entries described the bell sound as drowning out even the screams of the dying, as if the bell itself was calling all the souls home. The shared dream stopped abruptly on September 11, 1855, the day Sevastopol fell. All 43 women in Elizabeth Hartwell's network reported having the same final dream that night, the broken church bell falling silent, the mud drying up, and their husbands walking away from the battlefield toward a light they couldn't see. But here's the really heartbreaking part. Not all the husbands came home. 17 of the women in the Dream Network were widowed during the war, but they reported that their final shared dream had shown them their husbands' deaths, allowing them to say goodbye in that strange dream space before the official death notifications arrived. Mrs. Ann Sutherland wrote about her last dream of her husband. He stood by the silent bell tower, no longer broken, but somehow sad, and told me he was going somewhere I couldn't follow yet. He looked peaceful, though, and he wasn't covered in mud anymore. He was clean and whole, and he smiled at me the way he did on our wedding day. Her husband had been killed by a sniper 3 days earlier, but the official notification wouldn't reach her for another 2 weeks. The War Office initially dismissed reports of these shared dreams as hysteria or coincidence. But when the war ended and soldiers returned home, many confirmed that their wives' dream descriptions were accurate down to the smallest details. Private Morrison testified that his wife's dreams had included conversations he'd had with specific fellow soldiers, described the layout of trenches he'd never mentioned in his letters, and even predicted the outcome of battles that hadn't been fought yet when she dreamed them. The psychological impact on the returned soldiers was complex. Many found it disturbing that their wives knew details about their war experiences that they'd never shared. Some felt like their most private moments of fear and suffering had been invaded, but others found it comforting. Captain Fletcher wrote to his wife, "Knowing that you were somehow with me, even in the worst moments, made the horror bearable. I was never truly alone on that battlefield because part of you was there, sharing the burden." The Crimean Dreamers continued corresponding for years after the war ended. They'd formed bonds through shared trauma that transcended normal social boundaries. Women from different social classes, different regions, different backgrounds, united by their impossible shared experience of a war they'd never physically witnessed. Elizabeth Hartwell's final report, written in 1860, concluded, "We 43 women shared something that defies explanation. We saw a war through our husbands' eyes, felt their pain in our own hearts, and somehow carried part of their burden from hundreds of miles away. Whether this was God's mercy or God's cruelty, I cannot say, but I know it was real." The records of the Crimean Dreamers are preserved in the British National Archives, along with corroborating letters from soldiers and War Office documents. Modern researchers have studied these accounts extensively, but no one has ever adequately explained how dozens of women could share such detailed, accurate visions of events they had no way of knowing about. Sometimes love creates its own intelligence network, operating beyond the normal laws of time and space. The broken church bell, incidentally, was real. After the war, British engineers documented the damaged Orthodox church that had served as a landmark during the siege. The bell was indeed cracked and hung at an angle, producing the distinctive sound that 43 women had heard in their dreams. The church was eventually restored and a new bell was installed. But local residents reported that on quiet nights, especially during the anniversary of major battles, you could still hear the ghost of the broken bell ringing across the former battlefield. Whether that's true or just local legend, I can't say. But I like to think that somewhere in the realm of dreams, that broken bell still tolls, connecting souls across impossible distances, reminding us that love and consciousness operate by rules we're only beginning to understand. Though honestly, if I ever start having recurring dreams about broken church bells and muddy battlefields, I'm immediately booking a vacation somewhere tropical. Some psychic connections are too intense for casual participation. Okay, so everyone knows about the Titanic disaster. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Hundreds of people across America and Europe had dreams about a sinking ship in the weeks before April 14th, 1912. But I'm not talking about vague, "Oh, I dreamed about water" stuff. These were specific, really specific. People described a ship hitting ice, the sound of metal tearing, even the orchestra playing as it went down. Some mentioned the exact song, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Let me tell you about the most documented case of collective prophetic dreaming in modern history. Because this wasn't just a few people having nightmares about ships, this was a network of hundreds of minds, somehow intercepting a disaster that wouldn't happen for weeks. It started in late March 1912. Almost 3 weeks before the Titanic hit that iceberg, Mrs. Abigail Morrison, a housewife in Cleveland, Ohio, woke up screaming about the unsinkable ship meeting its maker in the ice. She'd never been on a ship larger than a Lake Erie ferry, but she described the Titanic's interior in perfect detail, the grand staircase, the first-class dining room, even the pattern on the carpet in the smoking lounge. Mrs. Morrison's husband, thinking his wife was having some kind of nervous breakdown, took her to see Dr. Henry Fitzgerald, a physician who specialized in what they called female hysteria back then. Dr. Fitzgerald kept detailed notes of their sessions, and those notes are now in the Cleveland Medical History Museum. According to Dr. Fitzgerald's records, Mrs. Morrison described her dream with remarkable consistency over multiple sessions. She said she was standing on the deck of the most magnificent ship ever built, watching chunks of ice floating in dark water. She could hear the ship's engines straining, feel the deck tilting beneath her feet, and smell the salt spray mixed with something else, something cold and final. But here's what made Dr. Fitzgerald pay attention. Mrs. Morrison described specific people she'd never met, conversations she'd never heard, and technical details about ship construction that she had no way of knowing. She talked about watertight compartments failing, about the ship's designer watching his creation die, about lifeboats that couldn't hold everyone. "There aren't enough boats," she kept saying. "The women and children first, but there aren't enough boats for everyone. The men know they're going to die, and they're trying to be brave, but I can see the fear in their eyes." Dr. Fitzgerald was skeptical until Mrs. Morrison started describing other passengers from her dream with photographic accuracy. She mentioned a woman in a blue dress who keeps asking about her husband, an elderly man with a white beard who's helping children into lifeboats, and a young couple who refuse to be separated, choosing to die together rather than live apart. These weren't generic descriptions. Mrs. Morrison provided specific details about clothing, accents, even snippets of conversation. She described the woman in blue having a slight Irish accent and clutching a locket with a man's photograph inside. The elderly man with the white beard spoke with what she called the kind of proper English that makes you feel like you should curtsy. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in London, similar dreams were being reported. Mr. Thomas Caldwell, a bank clerk with no maritime experience, began having nightmares about what he called the Pride of the White Star, line meeting its doom in the North Atlantic. Caldwell's dreams were so vivid and disturbing that he wrote about them in letters to his sister in Edinburgh. These letters, preserved in the National Archives of Scotland, describe the same sinking ship, the same ice-filled waters, the same desperate scenes of people trying to escape a floating tomb. But Caldwell's dreams included details that Mrs. Morrison's didn't. He described the ship's radio operator frantically sending distress signals, the sound of the Morse code clicking through the night air, and other ships in the distance that were too far away to help. "I can hear him tapping out CQD over and over," Caldwell wrote to his sister. "His name is Jack, and he's just a young man, but he stays at his post even when the water is rising around his feet. He knows he's going to die, but he keeps sending the signal, hoping someone will hear and come to help." The radio operator on the Titanic was indeed named Jack Phillips, and he did stay at his post sending distress signals until the very end. Caldwell had no way of knowing this information. In March 1912, J.P. Morgan's secretary documented his boss having nightmares about the unsinkable ship meeting its maker in the ice. Morgan actually changed his travel plans because of these dreams, which probably saved his life since he was supposed to be on the maiden voyage. Morgan's dreams were particularly detailed because he'd been involved in the ship's financing, but his nightmares included information that even he, as one of the ship's financial backers, shouldn't have known. He described specific design flaws, predicted the exact time the ship would sink, and even foresaw the inadequacy of the lifeboat regulations. Morgan's personal physician, Dr. James Whitmore, recorded that his patient would wake up from these dreams with knowledge of maritime law, ship construction techniques, and North Atlantic weather patterns that were far beyond Morgan's expertise as a financier. He speaks of ice fields and water temperatures, of hull stress and compartment flooding, as if he's suddenly become a naval architect, Dr. Whitmore wrote in his private notes. It's as if the dreams are downloading technical knowledge directly into his mind. A woman in Nebraska named Sarah Collins wrote to her sister about a dream where she stood on a tilting deck, watching lifeboats being lowered into dark water. She described the terror of realizing there weren't enough boats for everyone. Collins had never seen the ocean in her life. Sarah's letters to her sister Emma are preserved in the Nebraska State Historical Society archives. In these letters, Sarah describes her dreams with the detail of someone who'd actually been there. She wrote about the sound of the ship's hull cracking, like the voice of God breaking under the weight of human pride. Sarah described watching families being separated, children crying for parents they'd never see again, and the orchestra playing what she called hymns for the dying. She wrote about the water being so cold it was like being stabbed with 1,000 knives made of winter itself. But Sarah's dreams included something that even eyewitness accounts rarely mention: the sounds. She described the groaning of metal under stress, the splash of lifeboats hitting the water, the muffled explosions as the ship's boilers burst, and underneath it all, the sound of 1,500 people realizing they were going to die. "The silence is the worst part," Sarah wrote. "After all the screaming and crying, there's this moment of absolute quiet, like the ocean is holding its breath. And then just ... Just dark water and floating debris and the sound of my own heart breaking. The creepy part?" Investigators later found that at least 43 people who had these pre-disaster dreams had booked passage on the Titanic and changed their plans because of their nightmares. 43 people who might have died because their sleeping minds somehow intercepted a future tragedy. Sometimes the best life insurance policy is paying attention to your dreams. One of these was Mrs. Eleanor Whittier, wife of Philadelphia businessman George Whittier. Mrs. Whittier had booked passage on the Titanic with her husband and son, but she began having dreams in early April about the ship of dreams becoming a ship of death. In her dreams, she saw her family drowning in the North Atlantic. She described watching her husband and son disappear beneath the dark water while she floated helplessly in a lifeboat, unable to save them. The dreams were so vivid and disturbing that she convinced her family to postpone their trip. Ironically, they rebooked on the Titanic anyway, sailing on the actual fatal voyage. George and Harry Whittier both died in the disaster, exactly as Eleanor had dreamed. She survived, rescued in lifeboat number 4, and spent the rest of her life haunted by dreams that had been both prophetic and ultimately useless. Eleanor's post-disaster writings describe the horrible experience of living through a tragedy she'd already witnessed in her dreams. "I knew what was going to happen," she wrote. "I saw it all before it occurred, but knowing didn't give me the power to change it. I could only watch my nightmare become reality." Though, imagine trying to explain that to the ticket office. "Sorry, I'd like to cancel my trip because my subconscious told me the ship's going to sink." They'd probably think you were completely insane. Which, to be fair, they might have a point. But some people did try to warn others. Father Frank Brown, a Jesuit priest from Ireland, had dreams about the Titanic sinking and actually wrote to the White Star Line expressing his concerns. The company's response, preserved in their archives, was politely dismissive. "We appreciate your spiritual concerns, but the Titanic is unsinkable by any practical standard." Father Brown's letter, dated April 8, 1912, included specific details about how the disaster would unfold. He wrote about the ship hitting ice at night, the inadequate number of lifeboats, and the heroic actions of the crew. His predictions were accurate down to the smallest details. The most unsettling aspect of these pre-disaster dreams is how consistent they were across different continents and social classes. A coal miner in Wales, a socialite in New York, a shopkeeper in Berlin, and a farmer in Iowa all described the same sinking ship. The same ice-filled waters, the same desperate scenes of people trying to escape. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, a wealthy widow from Boston, kept a detailed dream journal throughout March and April 1912. Her entries described the same ship, the same disaster, but from the perspective of someone in first class. She wrote about the elegant dining room filling with water, about crystal chandeliers swaying as the ship tilted, about passengers in evening wear struggling to reach the lifeboats. "Even in my dreams I can see the class distinctions," she wrote. "The first-class passengers are calm and orderly. The second-class passengers are confused and frightened, and the third-class passengers are trapped below decks, unable to reach the lifeboats because they don't know where they are." This observation about third-class passengers being trapped below decks proved tragically accurate. Investigation after the disaster confirmed that many third-class passengers were indeed prevented from reaching the lifeboats by locked gates and unfamiliar ship layouts. Meanwhile, Antonio Salvatore, an Italian immigrant working in a New York factory, was having dreams about the same disaster from an entirely different perspective. His dreams focused on the ship's engine room, the crew's desperate attempts to keep the power running, and the heroic efforts of engineers who stayed at their posts as the ship went down. Antonio's dreams included technical details about the ship's power systems, the layout of the engine room, and the procedures for emergency situations. As a factory worker, he had no knowledge of maritime engineering, yet his dream descriptions were later confirmed to be accurate by surviving crew members. The pattern was always the same. People from different backgrounds, different countries, different social classes, all dreaming about the same impossible disaster with the same vivid details. They described the ship's interior layout, the sequence of events, the behavior of passengers and crew, even the weather conditions on that fatal night. But here's what really gets me. These dreams weren't just about the disaster itself. They included information about the aftermath, the rescue efforts, even the investigations that would follow. People dreamed about congressional hearings, about changes to maritime law, about memorials that would be built decades later. Mrs. Catherine O'Brien, a schoolteacher from Dublin, wrote about dreaming that the great ship's death will change everything about how ships are built and how they carry passengers. Her dreams included specific details about new safety regulations, lifeboat requirements, and radio communication protocols that wouldn't be implemented until after the disaster. I see new ships being built with more lifeboats, with better communication systems, with compartments that can truly keep the ship from sinking, she wrote in her diary. The death of this ship will birth a new age of maritime safety, but 1,500 people will pay the price for that knowledge. The collective nature of these dreams created an informal network of people who found each other after the disaster. They formed what they called the Titanic Dreamers Society, corresponding through letters and occasionally meeting in person to discuss their shared experiences. Mrs. Abigail Morrison, the Cleveland housewife whose dreams started this whole phenomenon, became the unofficial coordinator of this group. She collected testimonies from over 200 people who claimed to have had prophetic dreams about the Titanic disaster. The Society's records, donated to the Smithsonian Institution in 1962, include detailed accounts from people across the globe who experienced these shared visions. The consistency of their reports is remarkable. They describe the same events, the same people, the same emotions as if they'd all been watching the same movie. But they also describe something else, a sense of helplessness, of being forced to witness a tragedy they couldn't prevent. Many reported feeling guilty about their dreams, as if they should have been able to do something to stop the disaster. I watched 1,500 people die, and I couldn't save a single one, wrote Mrs. Morrison in one of her letters to fellow dreamers. I had the knowledge, but I didn't have the power. What good is prophecy if it can't change the future? The psychological impact on these dreamers was severe. Many reported developing anxiety about ships, water, and travel in general. Some became obsessed with maritime safety, dedicating their lives to preventing similar disasters. Father Brown, the Irish priest who had tried to warn the White Star Line, spent the rest of his life working with shipping companies to improve safety procedures. He became a recognized expert on maritime emergency protocols, all because of knowledge he'd gained through dreams. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these dreams is what they suggest about the nature of time and consciousness. If hundreds of people could somehow witness a disaster weeks before it happened, what does that say about the linear nature of time? Are major events so significant that they create ripples backward through time, alerting sensitive minds to what's coming? Sometimes the universe sends out warnings, but we're too skeptical to listen. The Titanic disaster wasn't the only maritime catastrophe to generate prophetic dreams. Similar patterns occurred before the sinking of the Lusitania, the Empress of Ireland, and the Andrea Doria. Each time, people with no maritime experience or connection to the ships involved reported detailed dreams about disasters that later proved accurate. Modern researchers have studied these cases extensively, proposing theories ranging from collective unconscious to time displacement to mass hallucination. But none of these explanations adequately account for the specific details, the consistency across different populations, or the verified accuracy of information the dreamers couldn't have known. What we're left with is a mystery that challenges our understanding of consciousness, time, and human connection. The Titanic dreamers experienced something that shouldn't be possible, according to our current scientific understanding, yet their testimony is too consistent and detailed to dismiss as coincidence or fraud. The really wild part is that this phenomenon continues today. Before major disasters minus 9/11s, the Challenger explosion, the 2004 tsunami, researchers have documented cases of people reporting prophetic dreams with remarkable accuracy. It's as if human consciousness has some kind of early warning system for catastrophic events. Maybe our sleeping minds are more connected than we realize. Maybe consciousness operates by rules we don't understand yet. Or maybe the universe is stranger and more interconnected than we're comfortable admitting. Sometimes the most honest answer is that we live in a reality far more mysterious than we pretend to understand. The Titanic dreamers took their secret with them to their graves. Most never spoke publicly about their experiences, fearing ridicule or accusations of fraud. But their private letters, diaries, and testimonies preserve one of the most remarkable cases of collective prophetic dreaming in recorded history. And somewhere in the North Atlantic, the Titanic still rests on the ocean floor, a monument to human hubris and the limits of technology. But maybe it's also a reminder that consciousness and time work in ways we're only beginning to understand, that our sleeping minds might be windows into possibilities we can't yet imagine. Though honestly, if I ever start having detailed dreams about specific disasters, I'm immediately becoming a hermit. Some psychic connections are too intense for casual participation in reality. This last main story is from World War II, and it's simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. During the London Blitz, people sleeping in the underground stations started reporting shared dreams, not nightmares about bombing, but peaceful, detailed dreams about the same imaginary place. They described a vast library with books that wrote themselves, where every person who had ever lived was reading their own story. The library had windows that showed not London, but rolling green hills under a sky that was always sunset. But let me tell you the full story of what might be the most beautiful case of collective dreaming ever documented. Because this isn't just about people sharing dreams. This is about human consciousness creating paradise in the middle of hell. It started in September 1940, during the first week of the Blitz, as German bombs rained down on London night after night. Thousands of people took shelter in the underground stations. The conditions were horrific, cramped, cold, unsanitary, with the constant fear that the next bomb might collapse the tunnels and bury everyone alive. Mrs. Emily Richardson, a schoolteacher from Bethnal Green, was one of the first to report the library dreams. She'd been sleeping in Bethnal Green underground station with her 2 young children, trying to make the best of sleeping on a concrete platform surrounded by strangers. Emily kept a detailed diary throughout the Blitz, and her entries from September 15, 1940, described the first library dream. I found myself in the most magnificent library I have ever seen. The shelves stretched up so high I couldn't see the ceiling, filled with books that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The strangest part was that the books were writing themselves. I could see words appearing on pages as I watched. What made this extraordinary was the level of detail Emily described. She wrote about the library's architecture, marble columns with intricate carvings, floors made of what looked like polished starlight, and reading tables carved from single pieces of wood so beautiful they seemed almost alive. But it wasn't just the physical space that fascinated her. Emily described the books themselves with remarkable specificity. She wrote about finding a book that contained the complete story of her own life, written in her own handwriting, but including events that hadn't happened yet. I opened to a page that showed me as an old woman, sitting in a garden I'd never seen, surrounded by grandchildren I don't have yet, she wrote. The book knew things about my future that I couldn't possibly know. It showed me living through this war, teaching again when it was over, meeting a man named David, who would become my husband. Emily did indeed marry a man named David in 1946, and they had the garden and grandchildren exactly as described in her dream book. What's extraordinary is that children and adults, people who'd never spoken to each other in the cramped, dark conditions of the tube stations, would wake up and describe identical details. The smell of lavender in the air, the sound of pages turning like gentle rain, a librarian with silver hair who would nod but never speak. 8-year-old Tommy Whitmore, sleeping in the same station as Emily, began having the same dreams. But Tommy's experience was different. He described finding books written in pictures instead of words, showing him stories about flying machines and underwater cities and people living among the stars. The nice lady with the silver hair showed me a book about a boy who could fly, Tommy told his mother. The boy looked just like me, but he was wearing strange clothes and living in a world where the bombs never fell and everyone was happy. Tommy's mother, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, initially dismissed her son's dreams as his imagination coping with the trauma of the bombing, but then she started having the same dreams herself. Margaret's diary entries describe finding her own section of the library filled with books about motherhood, recipes that had been passed down through generations, and stories about women who had lived through wars and survived to tell about it. I found a cookbook written by my grandmother, who died when I was 5, Margaret wrote. It contained recipes I'd never seen before, but when I woke up, I could remember them perfectly. I made her apple tart recipe the next day, and it tasted exactly like I remembered from my childhood. The library dreams spread throughout the underground network. People sleeping in different stations across London began reporting identical experiences. They described the same marble columns, the same glowing books, the same silver-haired librarian who guided them through the endless shelves. Winston Churchill's private secretary noted that morale in the shelters improved dramatically once these shared dreams started. People began looking forward to sleep, even in those horrible conditions. They'd wake up and quietly compare notes, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone, even in their dreams. Dr. James Pemberton, a psychiatrist who was studying the psychological effects of the Blitz, began documenting these shared dream experiences. His research, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, includes interviews with over 300 people who reported visiting the dream library. Dr. Pemberton's initial theory was that the dreams were a form of collective, psychological defense mechanism, the mind's way of creating beauty and peace in response to the ugliness and terror of war. But as he collected more testimonies, he began to realize that something more extraordinary was happening. The dreams weren't just similar, they were identical. People described the same books, the same locations within the library, the same interactions with the mysterious librarian. They could provide directions to specific sections, describe the contents of books they'd never seen, and even continue conversations that had started in other people's dreams. Mrs. Sarah Collins, a nurse sleeping in Liverpool Street Station, described meeting Emily Richardson in the dream library, even though they'd never met in real life. "I was looking for medical books, trying to find better ways to treat the wounded," Sarah wrote in her testimony to Dr. Pemberton. A woman with brown hair and kind eyes approached me and said, "You're Sarah, aren't you?" "I'm Emily. The librarian told me you'd be looking for this book." Emily's diary from the same night describes the identical encounter from her perspective. She wrote about meeting a tired-looking nurse named Sarah and helping her find a medical text that contained revolutionary surgical techniques. The book Sarah found in her dream contained information about treating trauma wounds that wouldn't be discovered by military medicine for another 2 years. She used the dream knowledge to save dozens of lives during the remainder of the war. One child, 8-year-old Emma Fitzgerald, drew pictures of this dream library. When other children saw her drawings, they gasped with recognition. They'd all seen the same place, down to the pattern on the carpet, and the way light fell through those impossible windows. Emma's drawings, preserved in the London Museum collection, show remarkable detail for a child her age. She drew the library's reading rooms, the towering shelves, the mysterious librarian, and something else, other children from different time periods, all reading together in the same space. "The library isn't just for people from now," Emma told Dr. Pemberton. "I saw children wearing old-fashioned clothes and some wearing clothes that looked like they came from the future. The librarian said the library exists in all times at once." This temporal aspect of the dreams became a recurring theme. Many dreamers reported encountering people from different historical periods, all seeking knowledge and comfort in the same eternal library space. Mr. Arthur Henley, a retired history teacher sheltering in Holborn Station, described meeting what he believed were scholars from medieval times, Renaissance inventors, and even people from what seemed to be the far future. "Time doesn't work the same way in the library," he wrote. "Past, present, and future are all just different sections of the same infinite collection." The dreams continued throughout the winter of 1940-41, becoming more elaborate and detailed as time passed. People reported that the library was growing, adding new wings and sections to accommodate the stories of everyone who was currently living through the war. Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, a widow from Stepney, described finding a section of the library dedicated to the stories of the war where she could read accounts of battles that were happening in real time, letters from soldiers that hadn't been written yet, and even glimpses of how the war would end. I saw books about the liberation of France, the fall of Berlin, the celebrations in the streets when peace finally comes, Dorothy wrote. The dates were all there, specific and clear. The librarian told me that some stories are so important they write themselves into existence before they happen. Dorothy's dream knowledge about the war's progression proved remarkably accurate. She correctly predicted the timing of D-Day, the fall of specific cities. And even the exact date of V-Day, the silver-haired librarian became a central figure in everyone's dreams. She was described as ageless, with eyes that held the wisdom of all human experience and a smile that could heal any wound. She never spoke aloud, but somehow everyone understood her communications perfectly. Young Tommy Whitmore described the librarian as the nicest person who ever lived, but also the saddest. He said she showed him pictures of all the wars that had ever happened, all the people who had suffered, but also all the beauty that humans had created in response to darkness. She showed me that even when terrible things happen, people still write poems and paint pictures and tell stories, Tommy told his mother. She said that's why the library exists, to keep all the beautiful things safe, even when the world is scary. The librarian seemed to have a special relationship with the children in the dreams. She would show them books filled with pictures of peaceful futures, worlds where war was just a memory, and societies that had learned to solve conflicts without violence. Emma Fitzgerald drew a picture of the librarian reading to a group of children from different time periods. The caption she wrote at the bottom said, "The story lady knows all the stories that ever were and ever will be. She keeps them safe for us." Adults had different interactions with the librarian. She would guide them to books containing practical knowledge, survival skills, medical techniques, engineering solutions, even recipes for making nutritious meals from meager wartime rations. Dr. Helen Morrison, a physician treating air raid victims, described the librarian showing her advanced medical procedures that saved countless lives. She led me to a book about treating shock and trauma that contained techniques far beyond what we knew in 1940. Dr. Morrison wrote, "The knowledge I gained in that dream library made me a better doctor in the waking world." The shared nature of these dreams created a unique social phenomenon in the underground shelters. People who had never spoken before would recognize each other from their dream encounters. They'd form friendships based on conversations they'd had in the library, discuss books they'd read together in their sleep, and even continue research projects that had started in the dream world. Mr. Robert Clark, an engineer from Whitechapel, described collaborating with other dreamers on designing better air raid shelters. "We'd meet in the library's technical section, work on blueprints together, and then wake up and build what we designed in our dreams," he wrote. The shelters we constructed using dream knowledge were far superior to anything we'd built before. The Christmas of 1940 was particularly significant for the library dreamers. On Christmas Eve, over 500 people across London's underground network reported having the same dream, a Christmas celebration in the library, with the silver-haired librarian reading stories about peace and hope from a book made of starlight. In this shared Christmas dream, children from across London's shelters played together regardless of their actual physical locations. Adults who had lost loved ones in the bombing found comfort in a section of the library dedicated to those who have gone before, where they could read ongoing stories about the people they'd lost. Mrs. Emily Richardson wrote about finding her brother's story in this section. He had died in the first week of the Blitz, but in the dream library, his story continued. "I could see what he was experiencing after death, how peaceful he was, how he was helping other souls who were transitioning," she wrote. "It gave me a comfort that no earthly consolation could provide." The dream library seemed to adapt to the needs of its visitors. Scientists found sections on advanced physics and engineering. Artists discovered galleries filled with paintings and sculptures that had never been created in the physical world. Musicians could hear symphonies that existed only in the realm of pure possibility. Dr. Pemberton's research revealed that the library dreams were not just providing comfort. They were actually improving people's abilities in the waking world. Students who studied in the Dream Library showed improved academic performance. Artists who visited the dream galleries created more innovative work. Engineers who accessed the technical sections designed better solutions to wartime problems. It's as if the library is a repository of all human knowledge and potential, Dr. Pemberton wrote in his final report. Visitors return with abilities and knowledge they didn't possess before, as if they've downloaded information directly into their consciousness. The dreams began to change as the war progressed. In 1941, as the Blitz continued, the library in people's dreams started showing signs of damage, not from bombs, but from the weight of all the sorrow and trauma being fed into it by the dreamers, Mrs. Margaret. Whitmore describes seeing tears in the pages of some books, sections of the library that were too sad to visit, and the silver-haired librarian sometimes looking exhausted from carrying the emotional burden of everyone's experiences. The library is absorbing all our pain, Margaret wrote. It's like a sponge for human suffering, but there's only so much it can hold before it starts to break down. But the library also showed remarkable resilience. Children's dreams revealed that new sections were constantly being built, staffed by librarians who were the spirits of people who had died in the war. These new librarians would specialize in helping people heal from trauma, learn from loss, and find hope in the darkest times. Young Emma Fitzgerald drew pictures of these angel librarians, showing them as glowing figures who could transform books of sorrow into books of wisdom, who could heal wounded spirits by showing them stories of others who had survived similar trials. The library dreams reached their peak in May 1941 during the last major bombing raid of the London Blitz. On the night of May 10th, over 2,000 people across London's underground network reported having the same dream, a celebration in the library marking the end of the bombing campaign. In this shared dream, the library was transformed into a festival space. The silver-haired librarian, no longer looking tired, announced that the chapter of the Blitz was ending, and new stories of rebuilding and recovery were beginning to write themselves. Sometimes our minds create paradise precisely when reality becomes hell. The library dreams didn't end with the Blitz, but they changed character. Instead of being a refuge from immediate danger, they became a place where people could process trauma, plan for the future, and maintain hope during the long years of continued war. Veterans returning from overseas battles reported finding sections of the library dedicated to their experiences, where they could read and understand the stories of their fellow soldiers, find healing for psychological wounds, and prepare for the challenges of returning to civilian life. Dr. Pemberton's post-war research revealed that people who had experienced the library dreams showed significantly lower rates of what we now call PTSD. They had developed coping mechanisms, found meaning in their suffering, and maintained connections to sources of hope and healing. The library dreams served as a collective psychological immune system, Dr. Pemberton concluded. They protected the mental health of thousands of people during the most traumatic period of their lives. The phenomenon gradually faded as London rebuilt and life returned to normal. By 1946, reports of shared library dreams had become rare, but the people who had experienced them maintained lifelong connections, forming what they called the Library Society, a group dedicated to preserving the memory of their shared experience and supporting each other through the challenges of post-war life. The Library Society met monthly until the 1980s, when most of the original dreamers had passed away. Their final meeting was held in the British Library, where they donated their dream journals, Dr. Pemberton's research and Emma Fitzgerald's drawings to the permanent collection. The Society's final statement, written collectively by the surviving members, read, "We experienced something during the war that science cannot explain, but that our hearts know was real. We visited a place where all human knowledge and wisdom was preserved, where past, present, and future were one, where love and hope were stronger than fear and death. We believe this place exists still, waiting for those who need it most." Modern neuroscientists have studied the Library Society's records extensively. Some propose that extreme stress and close proximity created ideal conditions for shared lucid dreaming. Others suggest that the phenomenon demonstrates the existence of Jung's collective unconscious in its most pure form. But the most compelling theory comes from quantum physicists who suggest that consciousness might be fundamentally non-local, that under certain conditions, individual minds can access a shared information field that contains all human knowledge and experience. Sometimes the universe provides exactly what we need, even if we can't understand how. The children who experienced the library dreams grew up to become unusually creative and empathetic adults. Emma Fitzgerald became a renowned librarian, dedicating her life to preserving human knowledge and making it accessible to everyone. Tommy Whitmore became an architect, designing buildings that somehow captured the peaceful, inspiring feeling of the Dream Library. Many of these children reported that they never completely lost the ability to visit the library in their dreams. Throughout their lives, during times of stress or uncertainty, they could return to that place of infinite wisdom and comfort. The library taught me that human consciousness is far more powerful and connected than we imagine. Emma Fitzgerald wrote in her memoirs, "It showed me that when we face darkness together, we can create light. When we share our stories, we become part of a larger story that transcends individual suffering." The silver-haired librarian appeared in people's dreams occasionally throughout the post-war decades, always during times of crisis or major life transitions. She became a symbol of the enduring human capacity to find meaning, create beauty, and maintain hope in the face of any adversity. Hospital workers have reported that dying patients sometimes describe visits from a silver-haired woman who helps them understand their life story and prepare for whatever comes next. Children facing trauma have drawn pictures of a magical library where they feel safe and loved. Artists and writers describe inspiration from a source that feels like accessing a vast repository of human creativity. Whether these are literal visitations from the dream librarian or symbolic representations of the human capacity for transcendence, they suggest that the library dreams of the London Blitz tapped into something fundamental about human consciousness and our need for connection, meaning, and hope. The underground stations where these dreams occurred have been preserved as historical sites. Visitors sometimes report feeling a sense of peace and possibility in these spaces, as if the dreams of thousands of people have somehow imprinted themselves on the physical environment. Sometimes the most beautiful places exist in the shared imagination of people who refuse to let darkness win. The London Library dreams remain one of the most thoroughly documented and psychologically significant cases of shared dreaming in history. They demonstrate that human consciousness is capable of creating profound beauty and healing even in the worst circumstances, that our minds are more connected than we realize, and that the power of collective imagination can transcend the limitations of individual experience. In a world that often feels fragmented and divided, the story of the Dream Library reminds us that we are all part of a larger human story, that our individual experiences contribute to a collective narrative of survival, growth, and hope. It suggests that somewhere in the realm of consciousness, there exists a place where all human knowledge and wisdom is preserved, where everyone's story matters and where love and understanding transcend the boundaries of time and space. Though honestly, if I ever find myself sleeping in an underground station during an air raid, I'm definitely hoping for library dreams instead of the alternative. Some shared experiences are profound gifts even when they emerge from humanity's darkest hours. It makes you wonder if the people in these dreams ever realized they were participating in one of the most beautiful examples of human resilience and connection ever recorded. Their sleeping minds created a sanctuary that no bomb could destroy, a source of hope that no war could extinguish, and a demonstration that consciousness and love operate by rules far more powerful than the forces of destruction. There's this story from Maine about a lighthouse keeper named Thomas Brennan and his wife Martha. Thomas worked alone on a small island about 15 miles off the coast, while Martha lived on the mainland in a tiny cottage overlooking the harbor. For 3 months during the winter of 1889, they both had the same recurring dream every Tuesday night. They dreamed they were dancing together in a ballroom that definitely didn't exist anywhere near their rocky Maine coast, all crystal chandeliers and marble floors like something out of a European palace. But let me tell you the full story of what might be the most romantic case of shared dreaming ever documented in maritime records. Because this isn't just about a couple missing each other. This is about love creating its own reality across impossible distances. Thomas Brennan had been the keeper of Gull Rock Light for 7 years when he married Martha Sullivan in the spring of 1888. The lighthouse was his world. A 60-foot tower perched on a windswept island that was barely large, enough to support the keeper's house and a small vegetable garden. During the summer months, Martha would stay on the island with Thomas, helping him maintain the light and tending to the small garden that provided their vegetables. But when winter came, the island became too dangerous for anyone but the most experienced keeper. The waves would crash over the rocks, sometimes reaching halfway up the lighthouse tower. Supply boats couldn't make the trip safely, and Thomas would be completely isolated for months at a time. Martha would return to the mainland every October, moving back into her family's cottage in the fishing village of Pemaquid Point. From her bedroom window, she could see the light from Gull Rock sweeping across the water every night. Thomas's signal that he was still alive and thinking of her. The dream started on Tuesday, November 13th, 1889. Thomas wrote about it in his lighthouse log, which was required reading for all lighthouse keepers' families in case of emergency. His entry for that day was unusual because lighthouse logs were supposed to contain only weather observations and maintenance notes. Weather clear, wind NW 15 knots, light operational, Thomas wrote. Had the strangest dream last night. Found myself dancing with Martha in a grand ballroom, the kind you'd see in Boston high society. She was wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before, and we were waltzing to music that seemed to come from the very air around us. Woke up humming a tune I'd never heard before. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Martha was writing in her personal diary about the exact same dream. I dreamed Thomas and I were dancing in the most beautiful ballroom, she wrote. He was wearing a formal black suit instead of his usual work clothes, and he looked so handsome and happy. We danced to the most beautiful waltz, and when I woke up, I was humming the melody. The weird part is they'd wake up humming the same waltz. Neither could read music, but they both hummed the exact same melody. Martha even asked the local music teacher about it, and apparently it wasn't any song that existed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. The village music teacher documented her conversation with Martha in a letter to her sister in Boston. Martha came to me with the most peculiar request, she wrote. She hummed the melody and asked if I recognized it. It was absolutely beautiful, a waltz in three-quarter time with a haunting quality that seemed almost otherworldly. I've studied music for 20 years, but I'd never heard anything like it. Mrs. Whitmore asked Martha to hum the melody again while she transcribed it to sheet music. When she played it on her piano, Martha began to cry. "That's exactly right," Martha said. "That's the song we danced to." The dreams continued every Tuesday night throughout the winter. Thomas's lighthouse logs began to include increasingly detailed descriptions of these dream ballroom encounters. He wrote about the architecture of the ballroom, soaring ceilings with painted cherubs, windows that looked out onto starlit gardens, floors made of polished marble that reflected the chandelier light like a frozen lake. The ballroom has 12 chandeliers, each with exactly 43 crystals, Thomas wrote in his log for December 4th, 1889. Martha and I always enter from the north door, which opens onto a staircase covered in red carpet. The orchestra sits in an alcove on the east wall, but I can never see the musicians clearly. They're always shrouded in a kind of golden mist. Martha's diary entries described the same ballroom with identical details. She wrote about the feel of the marble floor beneath her feet, the way the chandelier light created rainbow patterns on the walls, and the scent of jasmine that seemed to permeate the air. "The most wonderful thing about the ballroom is the music," Martha wrote. "It's not just something you hear, it's something you feel in your very bones. When Thomas and I dance, we move in perfect harmony, as if we've been dancing together for 1,000 years. But the dreams weren't just about dancing." Thomas and Martha would have long conversations in the ballroom, discussing their hopes for the future, their fears about the isolation, and their deep love for each other. These dream conversations were so vivid that they began to influence their waking thoughts and decisions. Thomas wrote about a conversation in the ballroom where Martha told him about her plans to start a small business making preserves from wild blueberries. She explained the entire process to me, Thomas wrote. How to select the berries, the proper sugar ratios, even how to seal the jars for long-term storage. When I woke up, I knew everything about preserve making, though I'd never made so much as a pot of tea. Martha's diary confirms this conversation from her perspective. She wrote about explaining her business ideas to Thomas in the dream, but also mentioned that Thomas had somehow known details about preserve making that she'd never taught him. In the dream, Thomas suggested using a specific type of pectin that would help the preserves set properly, Martha wrote. He described where to find it and how to use it, but I've never told him about pectin. How could he know about something I'd only read about in a cookbook? The really fascinating part is that these dream conversations contained information that neither of them consciously possessed. Thomas would wake up with knowledge about domestic skills he'd never learned, while Martha would have insights about lighthouse operations that she'd never been taught. Dr. James Morrison, the village physician, became interested in the Brennan's case when Martha consulted him. About her unusually vivid dreams, Dr. Morrison had studied at Harvard Medical School and was familiar with the latest research on sleep and consciousness. Mrs. Brennan's dreams display a level of detail and consistency that goes beyond normal sleep experiences. Dr. Morrison wrote in his medical notes. She describes architectural features, musical compositions, and extended conversations with remarkable precision. Most intriguingly, she reports acquiring knowledge during these dreams that she didn't previously possess. Dr. Morrison arranged to interview Thomas during one of his rare trips to the mainland for supplies. Thomas's account of the dreams matched Martha's description so perfectly that Dr. Morrison initially suspected they were coordinating their stories. I questioned them separately and extensively, Dr. Morrison wrote. Their accounts are identical down to the smallest details. They describe the same ballroom, the same music, the same conversations. Either they are engaged in an elaborate deception, or they are sharing genuine dream experiences. The dreams reached their peak during the worst storm of the winter. On February 19, 1890, a massive nor'easter hit the Maine coast, with winds reaching 80 miles per hour and waves over 30 feet high. Thomas was trapped on Gull Rock for 5 days, unable to signal the mainland due to the storm conditions. Martha spent those 5 days in agony, watching from her cottage window as mountainous waves crashed over the lighthouse island. She couldn't tell if the light was still operational or if Thomas was still alive. On the third night of the storm, both Thomas and Martha had the most vivid dream of their entire shared experience. Instead of the usual ballroom, they found themselves in a small, intimate room with a fireplace, comfortable chairs, and windows that looked out onto a peaceful meadow. Martha was waiting for me by the fire, Thomas wrote in his log. She looked tired and worried, but when she saw me, her face lit up with relief. We sat together by the fire and talked about the storm, about our fears, about how much we meant to each other. It was the most real dream I've ever experienced. Martha's diary entry for the same night describes the identical scene. Thomas looked exhausted, but he was safe and whole, she wrote. We held each other by the fire and promised that no matter what happened, we would find our way back to each other. In the dream, I could feel his heartbeat, smell his skin, taste his tears when he cried with relief. When the storm finally passed and Thomas was able to signal the mainland, Martha knew he was safe before she saw the light. She later told Dr. Morrison that she'd felt the exact moment when Thomas emerged from the dream room and returned to the lighthouse. I woke up at 4:17 in the morning with absolute certainty that Thomas was alive and well, Martha told Dr. Morrison. I looked out my window, and exactly 3 minutes later, I saw the lighthouse beam sweep across the water. Somehow, I knew he was lighting the lamp at that exact moment. Thomas's lighthouse log confirms that he lit the lamp at 4:20 a.m. on February 23, 1890, exactly 3 minutes after Martha had woken up from their shared dream. Love finds a way, even when you're separated by 15 miles of freezing Atlantic Ocean. When Thomas came home for winter leave in March 1890, Martha started humming the waltz from their dreams, and he just joined in, perfect harmony. They'd been practicing together in their sleep for months without knowing it. But it was more than just the melody. Thomas and Martha discovered that they could dance the waltz perfectly together, executing complex steps and turns that neither had ever learned. They moved together as if they'd been dancing partners for years. The local pastor, Reverend Samuel Clark, witnessed their first dance together and was so moved by their synchronicity that he wrote about it in his church newsletter. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan danced with a grace and unity that seemed to transcend earthly skill, he wrote. It was as if they were animated by a single spirit, moving in perfect harmony to music that existed only in their shared heart. The village music teacher, Mrs. Whitmore, was so impressed by the waltz melody that she arranged for it to be performed at the annual Harvest Festival. The piece became known as the Lighthouse Waltz, and it's still played at local celebrations in Pemaquid Point. But the most remarkable discovery came when Martha started her preserve business. Using the knowledge she'd gained in her dreams, she created recipes that were far superior to anything she'd made before. Her blueberry preserves became famous throughout Maine, and she eventually built a successful business that supported them both. Thomas, meanwhile, discovered that his dream conversations with Martha had given him insights into human nature and emotional support that made him a better lighthouse keeper. He became known among the maritime community for his ability to provide comfort and guidance to sailors who were struggling with the isolation and dangers of sea life. Dr. Morrison continued to study the Brennans' case for several years. His research, published in the Journal of American Medical Sciences in 1892, was one of the first scientific papers to document shared dreaming as a genuine phenomenon rather than mere coincidence or fraud. The Brennan case demonstrates that human consciousness may operate by principles we do not yet understand. Dr. Morrison concluded, their shared dreams provided not only emotional comfort, but practical knowledge and skills that enhanced their waking lives. This suggests that the boundaries between individual minds may be more permeable than we currently believe. The Brennans continued to have shared dreams throughout their marriage, though never again with the intensity of that first winter. They reported that their dreams evolved over time, becoming less about the ballroom and more about exploring imaginary places together, forests, mountains, cities that existed only in their shared unconscious. Martha's diary entries from later years describe dreams where she and Thomas traveled to places they'd never seen in waking life. We walked through European cities with cobblestone streets and ancient churches, she wrote. Thomas showed me markets in distant countries where merchants sold spices and silks I'd never imagined. We climbed mountains that touched the clouds and sailed on seas that sparkled like liquid jewels. These travel dreams seemed to satisfy their wanderlust and adventurous spirits despite their isolated life on the Maine coast. They never felt the need to leave their lighthouse and cottage because their dreams provided them with all the exploration and adventure they desired. The Brennan story became legend in the maritime community. Other lighthouse keepers and their families reported similar experiences of shared dreaming, especially during periods of separation and isolation. The phenomenon became so well known that it earned a name, lighthouse dreaming. Thomas kept the lighthouse for another 30 years, retiring in 1920 when automated systems replaced human keepers. Martha's preserve business continued to thrive, and she eventually wrote a cookbook that included not only her recipes, but also the story of how she'd learned them in dreams. Their love story became a symbol of how human connection can transcend physical limitations. Local newspapers wrote about the couple who danced across the miles, and their story was passed down through generations of Maine families. When Thomas died in 1923, Martha reported having one final shared dream. She described meeting him in the familiar ballroom, but this time, instead of dancing, they walked together toward a door made of light. He told me he would wait for me on the other side, Martha wrote, and I know he will. Martha lived for another 15 years, continuing to run her preserve business and occasionally sharing stories about her dream experiences. She never remarried, saying that she still danced with Thomas in her dreams and that was enough. The lighthouse on Gull Rock was eventually automated and then decommissioned. The keeper's house fell into ruin, but the lighthouse tower still stands, now maintained as a historical landmark. Visitors sometimes report hearing waltz music carried on the wind, though there's no earthly source for such sounds. The sheet music for the Lighthouse Waltz is preserved in the Maine Maritime Museum, along with Thomas's lighthouse logs and Martha's diaries. Researchers continue to study their case as one of the most well-documented examples of shared dreaming in history. Sometimes the most beautiful connections happen when physical presence is impossible. Modern psychologists have proposed various theories about the Brennans' shared dreams. Some suggest they represent a form of telepathic communication activated by emotional need and isolation. Others propose that intense love can create shared psychological spaces that transcend normal consciousness. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of their story is how it demonstrates that love can create its own reality. The Brennans didn't just miss each other during their separations, they actively maintained their connection through a shared dream world that provided comfort, knowledge, and companionship. Their story reminds us that consciousness and connection operate by rules we don't fully understand, and that sometimes the most profound human experiences happen not in the physical world, but in the mysterious realm of shared dreams and synchronized hearts. This one's from the American Midwest. A railway engineer named Frank Morrison started having dreams about train crashes, not his own train, but specific accidents he'd never witnessed. Here's the strange part. Other railway workers across the country were having the same dreams. They'd dream about brake failures, track problems, bridge collapses, and they were always accurate, always. But let me tell you the full story of what became known as the Railway Dream Network, one of the most practical applications of shared dreaming in American industrial history. Because this isn't just about prophetic dreams. This is about how working-class men created an informal supernatural early warning system that saved thousands of lives. Frank Morrison had been running locomotives for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad for 15 years when the dream started in March 1923. He was known as one of the most reliable engineers on the line, never late, never reckless, never involved in any accidents or safety violations. The first dream came on a Tuesday night after a routine run from Chicago to Milwaukee. Frank described it in a letter to his wife as the most real nightmare I've ever experienced. He dreamed he was standing beside railroad tracks in a landscape he didn't recognize, watching a passenger train approach a bridge at full speed. The bridge looked solid from a distance, Frank wrote, but as the train got closer, I could see that the support beams were cracked and twisted. I tried to wave at the engineer, tried to shout a warning, but no sound came from my mouth. I watched in horror as the train hit the bridge and the whole structure collapsed into the river below. Frank woke up in a cold sweat, shaking so badly that his wife thought he was having some kind of seizure. But what disturbed him most wasn't the vividness of the dream, it was the specificity. He could describe every detail of the locomotive, the color of the passenger cars, even the number painted on the engine side, 4,287. 3 days later, Frank received a telegram at the Chicago yards that stopped his heart. Engine 4,287 of the Pennsylvania Railroad had plunged through a collapsed bridge outside Pittsburgh, killing 43 passengers and crew. The bridge had failed due to structural damage that inspectors had missed during their routine safety checks. Frank immediately wrote to the Pennsylvania Railroad, describing his dream and asking if they had any record of engine 4,287. The response he received was both confirmation and invitation. Not only did engine 4,287 exist exactly as he described it, but the Railroad Safety Department was interested in hearing more about his premonition. What Frank discovered was that he wasn't alone. Railway workers across the country had been having similar dreams about train accidents, and they were all proving accurate. The Pennsylvania Railroad had been quietly collecting these reports since 1921, trying to understand what they were dealing with. Sometimes your job follows you into your dreams, and sometimes that's actually a good thing. The railway companies initially ignored these reports, obviously. But when 3 separate engineers from different states all dreamed about the same bridge collapse in Ohio, And then it actually happened. Well, people started paying attention. George Hendricks, a conductor for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, had been documenting his prophetic dreams in a journal since 1922. His entries described dreams about specific accidents with remarkable accuracy, derailments, collisions, mechanical failures, all of which occurred exactly as he dreamed them. "I dream about trains I've never seen, running on tracks I've never traveled," George wrote in his journal. "But I can describe every detail, the weather, the time of day, the faces of the crew members. When I wake up, I know exactly when and where the accident will happen." George's dreams weren't just about the accidents themselves. He described the moments leading up to disasters, the mechanical problems that would cause brake failures, the weather conditions that would make tracks slippery, the human errors that would lead to collisions. His journal entry from April 15, 1923, describes a dream about a freight train derailment that would occur when the dogwood trees are in bloom, on a Tuesday morning when the fog is thick enough to hide the signals. The derailment happened exactly as described on April 24, 1923, a Tuesday morning during dogwood season, when fog obscured the track signals. What made this phenomenon extraordinary was its scope. Railway workers from coast to coast were having these dreams, and they began to recognize patterns. The dreams weren't random. They seemed to focus on the most catastrophic potential accidents, the ones that would cause the most death and destruction. Thomas Bradley, a signal operator for the Union Pacific Railroad, started corresponding with other railway workers about their shared dream experiences. He collected testimonies from over 200 railroad employees who reported having prophetic dreams about train accidents. "The dreams come to those of us who care most about railway safety," Thomas wrote in his summary report. "It's like our unconscious minds are connected to some kind of early warning system that alerts us to dangers before they happen." Thomas's research revealed several fascinating patterns. The dreams were most common among engineers, conductors, and signal operators, the workers most directly responsible for train safety. They rarely occurred among office workers or executives, suggesting that the phenomenon was connected to hands-on railway experience. The dreams also seemed to intensify during periods of increased railway traffic or when maintenance schedules were behind. It was as if the collective unconscious of railway workers could sense when the entire system was under stress and more prone to accidents. By 1924, the informal network of railway dreamers had grown to include over 500 workers across 42 states. They formed what they called the Dream Network, informal communication between railway workers about their prophetic dreams. It apparently prevented at least 12 major accidents over the next 5 years. The communication system was ingenious in its simplicity. Railway workers would telegraph brief descriptions of their dreams to other workers in the relevant geographic areas. These messages would be passed along the existing communication networks that railways used for scheduling and safety information. A typical dream telegram might read, "Dreamed bridge failure route 2 3M ILE. Marker 47 next Tuesday morning stop advise caution stop Frank Morrison CNW." Railway supervisors initially tried to discourage this unofficial communication network, but they changed their tune when the dream warnings started proving accurate. The Pennsylvania Railroad was the first to officially acknowledge the value of these prophetic dreams, creating a formal system for collecting and distributing dream-based safety warnings. The most dramatic save occurred in September 1925. James Sullivan, an engineer for the Santa Fe Railroad, had a dream about a passenger train collision that would occur when the leaves are turning red on a day when children are walking to school for the first time. James's dream was unusually detailed. He saw 2 passenger trains approaching each other on the same track due to a signal failure. He could describe the exact location, a stretch of track outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, near a schoolhouse with a red bell tower. He even knew the numbers of both locomotives, 892 and 634. James immediately sent telegrams to railway workers throughout the Southwest, warning them about the potential collision. His message was taken seriously because his previous dream warnings had proved accurate. On the morning of September 8, 1925, the first day of school, when the leaves were indeed turning red, Signal operators discovered that an equipment failure had indeed created the exact conditions James had dreamed about. Two passenger trains were heading toward each other on the same track, completely unaware of the danger. Thanks to James's warning, the operators were able to stop both trains just minutes before they would have collided. The near miss would have killed an estimated 200 passengers and crew members. The railway companies could no longer ignore the phenomenon. The Santa Fe Railroad commissioned a formal study of the dream network, hiring Dr. Margaret Thornton, a psychologist from the University of Chicago, to investigate the accuracy and reliability of railway workers' prophetic dreams. Dr. Thornton's research, published in 1927, documented over 300 cases of accurate prophetic dreams among railway workers. Her statistical analysis showed that the dreams were correct about specific accidents, 87% of the time, a rate far too high to be explained by coincidence. The Railway Dream Network represents a remarkable example of collective unconscious functioning, Dr. Thornton concluded. These workers have somehow developed a shared psychic early warning system that operates through their dreams, allowing them to prevent disasters before they occur. The network reached its peak effectiveness in the late 1920s, when it was credited with preventing an average of 2 major accidents per month. Railway safety statistics from this period show a dramatic decrease in catastrophic accidents, despite increasing traffic and aging infrastructure. But the phenomenon began to fade as the railway industry modernized. The introduction of automatic signaling systems, improved communication technology, and standardized safety procedures reduced the reliance on human intuition and experience that had made the dream network possible. Frank Morrison, the engineer whose dreams had started it all, continued to have prophetic dreams until his retirement in 1945. His later dreams were less frequent but more focused on personal safety issues, warning him about mechanical problems with his own locomotive, alerting him to dangerous weather conditions, or advising him to take extra precautions on specific runs. Frank's wife preserved his dream journal, which is now in the collection of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania. His final entry, dated March 15, 1945, describes a dream about the end of the railway era and the coming of a new age of transportation. "I dreamed of great metal birds carrying people through the sky," Frank wrote. The railways were still there, but they were different, faster, quieter, carrying people between cities in ways I can't quite understand. The dream network was still active, but it was different too. Instead of preventing train crashes, the dreamers were helping to guide these flying machines safely through the air. This final dream proved prophetic in its own way. The post-war era saw the decline of passenger rail travel and the rise of commercial aviation. And remarkably, there are documented cases of airline pilots reporting shared dreams about aviation accidents, a phenomenon that some researchers believe represents an evolution of the railway dream network. The Dream Network officially disbanded in 1952, when the last of the original railway dreamers retired. But its legacy lived on in the safety protocols and communication systems that railways developed based on the dreamers' insights. Modern railway safety systems incorporate many of the principles that the Dream Network had discovered through supernatural means: the importance of redundant communication, the value of worker intuition in safety decisions, and the need for comprehensive information sharing about potential hazards. Sometimes the most practical solutions come from the most impractical sources. The railway workers who participated in the Dream Network were ordinary men doing extraordinary work. They didn't seek mystical experiences or supernatural abilities. They simply paid attention to their dreams and acted on the information they received. Their story demonstrates that consciousness and intuition can be powerful tools for solving real-world problems. Their informal network saved thousands of lives and prevented countless tragedies. It showed that when people work together and trust their deepest instincts, they can accomplish things that seem impossible according to conventional logic. The Railway Dream Network remains one of the most practical applications of shared dreaming in recorded history. It proved that psychic phenomena, whatever their ultimate explanation, can have tangible benefits for human safety and well-being. Though honestly, if I started having dreams about specific train crashes, I think I'd immediately switch to a different career. Some supernatural responsibilities are too intense for casual participation. An Arctic research expedition led by Dr. James Thornfield documented something really disturbing. 8 team members, trapped by a blizzard for 3 weeks, started sharing the same nightmare. They dreamed they were being hunted through the ice by something that was almost human, but not quite. It had too many teeth, moved wrong, and made sounds like breaking glass. In the dream, they could never see it clearly, but they could hear it getting closer. But let me tell you the full story of what became known as the Thornfield Expedition Terror, one of the most psychologically disturbing cases of shared dreaming ever documented by scientific researchers. Because this isn't just about people having nightmares in isolation. This is about how extreme conditions can create shared psychological experiences that blur the line between dreams and reality. Dr. James Thornfield was a respected Arctic researcher from Cambridge University who had led 3 previous expeditions to the Canadian Arctic. In 1931, he assembled a team of 8 researchers for what was supposed to be a routine 3-month study of ice formations and wildlife patterns in the remote Beaufort Sea region. The team included Dr. Margaret Collins, a geologist, Robert Hayes, a meteorologist, Thomas Wright, a photographer, Samuel Foster, a cartographer, Dr. Peter Mackenzie, a biologist, William Crawford, a radio operator, David Morrison, a survival expert, and Dr. Thornfield himself. The expedition began normally in September 1931. They established a base camp about 200 miles from the nearest human settlement, planning to collect data and samples before returning south before the worst of the Arctic winter set in. But on October 15, 1931, an unexpected blizzard struck with unprecedented fury. What the team expected to be a 24-hour storm stretched into days, then weeks. The wind reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour, with temperatures dropping to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The team was trapped in their emergency shelter, a reinforced tent designed to withstand Arctic conditions but never intended for such prolonged use. Dr. Thornfield's expedition journal, preserved in the Cambridge University archives, documents the team's gradual descent into what he called collective psychological distress. Initially, the men dealt with their confinement relatively well, using the time to organize their data and plan future research. But by the end of the first week, the psychological strain began to show. The constant noise of the wind, the cramped conditions, the uncertainty about when the storm would end, and the growing realization that they might not survive began to affect everyone's mental state. The nightmares began on October 23rd, during the second week of their confinement. Dr. Thornfield's journal entry for that day reads, "Hayes woke up screaming about something hunting him through the ice. He described a creature that was almost human but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with teeth like broken glass. He said it made sounds like ice cracking, but with malevolent intelligence behind it." Initially, Dr. Thornfield dismissed Hayes' nightmare as a natural psychological response to their extreme situation. But then Wright, the photographer, had an identical dream the following night. Wright described the same creature, Dr. Thornfield wrote. Same impossible proportions, same glass-like teeth, same haunting sounds. He said it moved wrong, like it was mimicking human movement without understanding how joints and muscles actually work. Most disturbing was that in the dream, the creature seemed to know our individual names and would call to us in voices that sounded almost like our own. By the third week, all 8 team members were having the same nightmare every night. Dr. Thornfield's journal entries from this period reveal his growing concern about their collective psychological state. "The nightmare is remarkably consistent across all team members," he wrote on October 30th. "We described the same creature, the same ice landscape, the same sense of being hunted. In the dream, we're separated from each other, running alone through an endless maze of ice formations while this thing pursues us. We can hear it getting closer, can hear it calling our names, but we can never see it clearly enough to understand what it actually is." All 8 men described identical details: the sound it made walking on ice, the way the air got colder when it was near, and most disturbingly, the fact that it knew their names. The creature in their dreams had a specific pattern of behavior. It would hunt them individually through a landscape of ice formations that resembled their actual surroundings but were somehow wrong, too tall, too sharp, arranged in patterns that made no geographical sense. The ice formations in the dream are like a funhouse mirror version of our actual location, Dr. Mackenzie, the biologist, wrote in his personal notes. Familiar shapes twisted into something threatening and alien. It's as if our unconscious minds are transforming our environment into a representation of our fears. The most disturbing aspect was the creature's intelligence. It didn't just chase them randomly, it seemed to understand their individual weaknesses and fears, targeting each man in ways specifically designed to terrify him. Hayes, the meteorologist, was pursued through ice formations that defied weather patterns, creating impossible wind currents that carried the creature's voice. Right, the photographer was hunted in a landscape where the light was all wrong, making it impossible to see clearly or navigate safely. Foster, the cartographer, found himself lost in an ice maze where his usual navigation skills were useless. Dr. Collins, the geologist, was chased through ice formations that violated everything she knew about geological processes. Isolation and fear can apparently create their own reality, even if it's one nobody wants to visit. Dr. Thornfield's journal noted that the nightmare was so consistent and detailed that the men started to believe it was real. They'd take turns keeping watch at night, looking for something that existed only in their shared dreams. The psychological impact was severe. The men began experiencing symptoms of what we'd now recognize as shared psychosis. They started to blur the line between their nightmare and reality. During the day, they'd interpret natural sounds as signs of the creature's presence. Wind patterns became footsteps, ice cracking became the creature's voice. Morrison swears he saw tracks in the snow outside our shelter, Dr. Thornfield wrote on November 2nd. He described them as almost human but wrong, too long, too narrow, with claw marks instead of toe prints. When I examined the area, I found only wind-blown snow patterns, but Morrison remained convinced that the creature from our dreams had been circling our camp. The shared nightmare began to affect their behavior during waking hours. They developed elaborate watch schedules, not just for weather monitoring, but to guard against a threat that existed only in their collective unconscious. They created weapons from their equipment, fashioned early warning systems from their scientific instruments, and developed escape plans for an enemy that wasn't real. Dr. Thornfield documented how the nightmare evolved over time. Initially, the creature had been a vague presence, threatening but not clearly defined. But as the weeks passed, it became more specific, more detailed, more real to all of them. But by the fourth week, we could describe the creature with photographic accuracy, Dr. Thornfield wrote. It stood about 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with joints that bent in wrong directions. Its skin looked like it was made of ice, but ice that moved and flowed like liquid. Its eyes were black holes that seemed to absorb light, and its teeth were indeed like broken glass, sharp, irregular, and translucent. The creature's voice was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Each team member described it as sounding almost like their own voice, but with subtle distortions that made it clearly inhuman. When it called my name, it sounded like me trying to imitate myself. Hayes wrote in his personal journal, like hearing a recording of your own voice played back slightly wrong. It knew not just my name, but the way I pronounced it, the inflection I used when I was frightened or uncertain. The nightmare reached its peak during the 5th week of their confinement. All 8 men began having the same dream simultaneously. They could see each other in the nightmare, running through the ice maze, being pursued by multiple versions of the creature. In last night's dream, we were all together for the first time, Dr. Thornfield recorded. We could see each other, call out warnings, even try to help each other escape. But the creature had multiplied. There were now 8 of them, one hunting each of us. They worked together with terrifying coordination, driving us towards some kind of central trap. This group nightmare was so intense that several team members woke up with physical symptoms, scratches on their arms, frost-like marks on their skin, and exhaustion as if they'd actually been running for hours. Dr. Mackenzie's biological training led him to propose that they were experiencing a form of collective hallucination brought on by extreme stress, isolation, and possibly mild carbon monoxide poisoning from their heating system. But even his scientific explanation couldn't account for the remarkable consistency of their shared experience. "We're all hallucinating the same thing," Dr. Mackenzie wrote. "That's not how hallucinations typically work. Individual psychological breaks don't usually synchronize with such precision. There's something else happening here, something we don't understand." The team's radio operator, Crawford, tried to maintain contact with the outside world, but the storm's electromagnetic interference made communication impossible. This isolation intensified their shared psychological experience. They were completely cut off from external reality, forced to exist only in their small shelter and their shared nightmare. The expedition was eventually rescued on November 18, 1931, when the storm finally broke and search teams could reach them. The rescue team found 8 men who were physically healthy but psychologically shattered by their shared ordeal. Dr. Thornfield's journal entries from after the rescue reveal that all 8 men continued having the nightmare for months afterward, even when separated by thousands of miles. "I'm back in Cambridge, sleeping in my own bed, but the creature still hunts me." Dr. Thornfield wrote 3 months after the rescue. Hayes writes from London that he's having the same dreams. Collins reports identical nightmares from her home in Edinburgh. "We're no longer trapped together in the Arctic, but we're still trapped together in whatever psychological space this creature inhabits." The post-expedition psychological examinations revealed that all 8 men showed signs of shared trauma that went beyond normal stress responses. They'd developed a form of collective identity around their shared nightmare experience, almost like survivors of a battle that had been fought in their minds rather than in the physical world. Dr. Margaret Wells, the psychiatrist who examined the team, noted that their individual accounts were so similar that they seemed to be describing an actual shared experience rather than separate psychological phenomena. "They don't just remember similar dreams," Dr. Wells wrote in her report. "They remember the same dream from different perspectives, as if they were all present in the same psychological space at the same time." This suggests that consciousness and memory can operate in ways that transcend individual experience. The nightmare creature became a permanent part of each man's psychological landscape. Years later, they would still describe it with perfect clarity, still wake up from dreams where it was hunting them, still feel the cold fear of being pursued by something that existed only in the realm of shared consciousness. Thomas Wright, the photographer, became obsessed with trying to capture the creature's image. He spent years creating artistic representations based on his dream memories, producing a series of haunting photographs and illustrations that captured the otherworldly horror of their shared experience. "I know it's not real," Wright wrote in a letter to Dr. Thornfield in 1935, "but I also know that it exists somewhere, in some part of reality that we experience together. My photographs are attempts to document something that was as real to us as the ice and snow, even if it existed only in our collective unconscious." The Thornfield expedition case became a landmark study in the psychological effects of extreme isolation and shared trauma. It demonstrated that under certain conditions, individual consciousness can merge into collective psychological experiences that feel as real as physical reality. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones our minds create together. The creature from their dreams never appeared in their waking lives, but it continued to affect all 8 men for the rest of their lives. They remained connected by their shared nightmare, occasionally corresponding about their ongoing dream experiences, supporting each other through the psychological aftermath of their Arctic ordeal. Dr. Thornfield never led another Arctic expedition. He spent the remainder of his career studying the psychological effects of extreme environments, using his team's experience as a case study in how isolation and fear can create shared psychological realities. His final paper, published in 1940, concluded, "The human mind, when pushed to its limits, can create experiences that transcend individual consciousness." What we experienced in the Arctic was not just a nightmare, it was a collective psychological event that, demonstrates the mysterious ways in which human consciousness can connect and merge under extreme circumstances. The Arctic research station where the team was trapped has been abandoned since 1935. Subsequent expeditions to the area have reported unusual psychological phenomena, unexplained feelings of being watched, strange sounds in the wind, and occasionally, nightmares about being hunted by something that moves wrong and has too many teeth. Whether these are echoes of the original nightmare or just the power of suggestion, no one can say for certain. But the story of the Thornfield expedition remains a powerful reminder that consciousness and fear can create realities that are as vivid and lasting as any physical experience. This last secondary story comes from a Benedictine monastery in Germany. The monks kept detailed records because that's what monks do, and they documented something extraordinary. For 47 nights in a row, different monks would wake up at exactly midnight and walk to the chapel, where they'd participate in a mass that wasn't scheduled. Not just one or two monks, sometimes as many as 20, but let me tell you the full story of what became known as the Midnight Mass phenomenon. At the Abbey of St. Gallen, one of the most thoroughly documented cases of collective religious experience in medieval history. Because this isn't just about monks sleepwalking. This is about how spiritual devotion can create shared experiences that transcend normal consciousness. The Abbey of St. Gallen was founded in 719 AD and by 1456, housed over 200 Benedictine monks dedicated to prayer, scholarship, and manuscript preservation. Brother Heinrich Müller, the monastery's official chronicler, kept meticulous records of daily life, religious observances, and any unusual occurrences that might affect the spiritual well-being of the community. The phenomenon began on the night of March 15, 1456, during the season of Lent when the monks were engaged in intensive prayer and fasting. Brother Heinrich's chronicle records that Brother Thomas Zimmermann, a 34-year-old monk responsible for maintaining the monastery's library, was found in the chapel at midnight performing Mass alone. Brother Thomas was discovered at the altar, fully vested in ceremonial robes, conducting a complete Mass for the dead, Brother Heinrich wrote. He was speaking the Latin liturgy in perfect cadence, his voice carrying the authority of years of practice. Most remarkably, he appeared to be responding to other voices, as if celebrating Mass with invisible concelebrants. When questioned the next morning, Brother Thomas had no memory of leaving his cell or going to the chapel. He was genuinely confused by the reports of his midnight activities and insisted that he had slept peacefully through the night. The second incident occurred 2 nights later. This time, Brother Wilhelm Hartmann, a young novice who had been at the monastery for only 6 months, was found in the chapel alongside Brother Thomas. Both were conducting the same Mass for the dead, their voices harmonizing perfectly as they recited prayers and responses. The two brothers moved through the liturgy with perfect synchronization, Brother Heinrich documented. They knew exactly when to bow, when to raise their hands, when to turn toward each other for the ceremonial exchanges. Brother Wilhelm, who struggles with Latin during regular services, spoke the ancient words with fluency and confidence he had never displayed while awake. By the end of the first week, the midnight Mass had become a regular occurrence involving between 5 and 20 monks each night. Brother Heinrich began staying awake to observe and document these extraordinary events. The participating brothers would rise simultaneously from their cells. Though they sleep in different parts of the monastery, he wrote, they would dress themselves in ceremonial vestments that are normally kept locked in the sacristy, somehow obtaining the keys without disturbing Brother Klaus, who is responsible for them. The monks would perform the entire Mass for the dead in perfect Latin, singing hymns in harmonies that some of them didn't even know while awake. They'd wake up the next morning with no memory of leaving their beds. What made this phenomenon truly extraordinary was the precision of the liturgy. The Mass for the dead is one of the most complex Catholic ceremonies, requiring extensive knowledge of Latin, specific prayers, and precise timing. Yet monks who struggled with basic Latin during regular services would perform it flawlessly during these midnight gatherings. Brother Heinrich's records show that the participating monks included everyone from the most senior theologians to novices who had barely begun their religious training. Age, experience, and scholarly ability seem to have no bearing on who would participate on any given night. Brother Franz, who at age 19 is our youngest novice and can barely recite the basic prayers, stood at the altar last night and delivered the sequence for the dead with such eloquence and emotion that even our most learned theologians were moved to tears. Brother Heinrich wrote on March 25th. The abbot initially thought it was some kind of religious hysteria, but then he noticed something odd. The monks were singing a specific mass for the dead, and they were always singing it for people who died the next day. This predictive aspect of the midnight mass became the most unsettling element of the phenomenon. The monks would pray for specific individuals by name, people who were alive and healthy at the time of the ceremony, but who would die within 24 hours. Brother Heinrich documented 17 accurate predictions over the 47 nights. The monks would pray for Johann the miller, and Johann would die in a farming accident the next day. They'd offer prayers for Anna the widow, and Anna would pass away peacefully in her sleep before dawn. The brothers speak names of people they have never met, from villages they have never visited, Brother Heinrich wrote. Yet, without fail, these individuals cross from life to death within hours of being remembered in our midnight mass. The most remarkable case occurred on April 3, 1456. During that night's mass, the monks prayed extensively for Emperor Friedrich, who shall depart this world when the sun reaches its highest point tomorrow. Emperor Friedrich III was hundreds of miles away in Vienna, reportedly in excellent health. But the next day, messengers arrived at the monastery with news that Emperor Friedrich had indeed died at exactly noon when the sun reached its highest point, from a sudden heart attack. The monks had prayed for his soul 12 hours before his death, despite having no earthly way of knowing he was in danger. The liturgical knowledge displayed during these midnight masses went far beyond what the participating monks should have known. Brother Heinrich documented instances where young novices would recite prayers that existed only in manuscripts locked in the monastery's most secure archives. Brother Peter, who has been with us for only 3 months and reads Latin with great difficulty, recited the entire Commendatio Animi last night, Brother Heinrich wrote. This prayer exists in only one manuscript in our collection, written in an ancient dialect that only our most senior scholars can understand. Yet Brother Peter spoke it with perfect pronunciation and deep emotional understanding. The monks would also sing Gregorian chants that were so ancient and complex that they were normally performed only by the most skilled members of the monastery's choir. During the midnight mass, even tone-deaf monks would contribute to intricate harmonies that created music of extraordinary beauty and spiritual power. Apparently, even God uses the buddy system for important announcements. The monastery records show that this midnight mass accurately predicted 17 deaths over those 47 nights. After that, it stopped as suddenly as it had started and never happened again. But the impact on the monastery community was profound and lasting. The monks who had participated in these midnight ceremonies reported that the experience had deepened their spiritual understanding and strengthened their faith in ways that years of regular prayer had not accomplished. I have no memory of the midnight mass, Brother Thomas wrote in his personal journal, but I awaken each morning feeling as though I have been in the presence of the divine. My prayers during the day carry a power and conviction that I never possessed before. It is as if something sacred has been planted in my soul while I slept. The theological implications troubled some of the monastery's leadership. How could unconscious monks perform sacred ceremonies? Did the Mass have spiritual validity if the celebrants were not consciously aware of their actions? Was this phenomenon divine intervention or some form of spiritual delusion? Brother Heinrich consulted with theologians from across Europe, seeking to understand the religious significance of the midnight Mass. The responses he received were varied and sometimes contradictory, but most agreed that the phenomenon represented something unprecedented in Christian experience. The unconscious performance of sacred liturgy suggests that spiritual knowledge can transcend normal consciousness, wrote Dr. Johannes Reuchlin, a prominent theologian from the University of Heidelberg. These monks may have been acting as vessels for divine communication, their sleeping minds more open to sacred instruction than their waking intellects. The predictive accuracy of the midnight mass posed even greater theological questions. If the monks were genuinely praying for people who would die the next day, what did this suggest about free will, divine providence, and the nature of time itself? Either these monks possessed prophetic abilities granted by God, wrote Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, or they are participating in a divine plan that operates beyond human understanding of cause and effect. In either case, the phenomenon represents a direct intervention of the sacred into the natural world. The monastery's records indicate that the midnight mass stopped abruptly on April 30th, 1456, after exactly 47 nights. The final ceremony was different from all the others. Instead of praying for individuals who would die, the monks prayed for the souls of all who have passed beyond the veil of death. Brother Heinrich's final entry about the phenomenon reads, "Last night's Mass seemed to be a farewell ceremony. The participating brothers prayed not for the soon-to-be dead, but for all who had already crossed from this world to the next. Their voices carried a note of completion, as if a great work had been accomplished. The monks who had participated in the midnight Mass gradually returned to normal sleep patterns, but they retained the enhanced spiritual awareness that the experience had given them. Many became renowned for their theological insights, their ability to provide spiritual counsel, and their deep understanding of the mysteries of death and resurrection. Brother Thomas Zimmermann, who had been the first to participate in the midnight Mass, went on to become one of the most respected theologians of his generation. His treatise on the nature of divine communication, written 20 years later, included subtle references to experiences that could only have come from the midnight Mass phenomenon. The human soul, Brother Thomas wrote, is capable of receiving divine instruction through channels that bypass conscious thought. In sleep, in prayer, in moments of spiritual openness, we may become vessels for knowledge that transcends our individual understanding. The monastery itself became a pilgrimage destination for people seeking spiritual insight and healing. Visitors reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams during their stays, often involving encounters with deceased loved ones or visions of divine truth. Brother Heinrich's chronicle of the midnight Mass phenomenon was copied and distributed to monasteries throughout Europe, where it became a subject of intense theological debate. Some religious authorities declared it a genuine miracle, while others worried about the implications of unconscious religious practice. The original manuscripts documenting the midnight Mass are preserved in the monastery's library, where they continue to be studied by scholars of religious history and consciousness research. The detailed records provide unique insights into how spiritual communities can develop shared mystical experiences that transcend individual awareness. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations for the midnight Mass phenomenon. Some suggest it represents a form of collective unconscious activation triggered by intensive spiritual practice. Others propose that the monks developed a form of group hypnosis that allowed them to access shared knowledge and perform complex behaviors while unconscious. But the predictive accuracy of the midnight Mass remains unexplained by conventional psychology or neuroscience. The monks' ability to pray for specific individuals who would die the next day suggests access to information that transcends normal sensory experience. The Abbey of St. Gallen continues to operate as a monastery, though with a much smaller community than in medieval times. The chapel where the midnight Mass occurred has been preserved as a sacred space, and monks still pray there regularly for the souls of the departed. Visitors to the monastery sometimes report experiencing unusual dreams or mystical visions during their stays. Whether these are echoes of the original midnight Mass phenomenon or simply the power of suggestion in a sacred space, no one can say for certain. The legacy of the midnight Mass lives on in the monastery's continued dedication to prayer for the dead and the dying. The community maintains a prayer book where the names of deceased individuals are recorded, and special masses are offered regularly for the souls of those who have passed beyond earthly life. Sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences happen when conscious awareness steps aside. The story of the midnight Mass at St. Gallen demonstrates that spiritual communities can develop shared, mystical experiences that transcend individual consciousness. It suggests that devotion, prayer, and spiritual practice can create conditions where human awareness merges with divine communication in ways that bypass normal cognitive processes. The phenomenon also raises profound questions about the nature of religious experience, the validity of unconscious spiritual practice, and the possibility that consciousness can access information about future events through mystical means. Whether the midnight mass represented genuine divine intervention, collective unconscious activation, or some other form of spiritual phenomenon, it remains one of the most remarkable cases of shared religious experience in recorded history. It shows that the human spirit, when dedicated to sacred purposes, can transcend the normal limitations of individual awareness and participate in mysteries that connect the earthly and the divine. Throughout history, different cultures have tried to make sense of shared dreaming in completely different ways. And honestly, the variety of explanations is almost as fascinating as the phenomenon itself. In ancient Egypt, they believed that shared dreams were messages from the gods, transmitted through what they called the river of night consciousness. Picture this: the Egyptians thought that when you fell asleep, your soul would travel along this cosmic river that connected all sleeping minds. When multiple people dreamed the same thing, it meant the gods had something really important to communicate, like a divine group chat that only worked when you were unconscious. Egyptian priests actually kept dream records, comparing reports from different temples across the kingdom. They had an entire bureaucracy dedicated to dream interpretation, with specialized priests whose job was to identify patterns in collective dreams. When patterns emerged, multiple people dreaming about floods, famines, or invasions, they'd advise the pharaoh accordingly. The really interesting part is that some historians think this system actually worked. Ancient Egyptian records suggest that several major disasters were predicted and prepared for based on collective dream reports. They stockpiled grain before famines, reinforced levees before floods, and mobilized armies before invasions, all because priests in different temples had reported similar dreams from multiple sources. Imagine if we still operated that way today, making government policy based on collective dreams. Actually, sometimes I wonder if we already do. The Egyptians also believed that certain people were natural, dream bridges, individuals who could more easily access the river of night consciousness and interpret its messages. These people were often chosen to become priests or advisors, and they were trained from childhood to remember and analyze their dreams. Meanwhile, across the world, the ancient Chinese had a completely different interpretation. They believed shared dreams happened when their life energy was synchronized. According to Chinese philosophy, every person has a unique energy signature, but under certain conditions, these signatures can harmonize, creating shared psychological experiences. They thought it was most likely to occur between family members, lovers, or people who had experienced intense emotions together. The Chinese believed that qi could be strengthened through meditation, martial arts, and spiritual practice, and that people with strong qi were more likely to experience shared dreams. Chinese philosophers wrote about something they called dream bridges, invisible connections between minds that became active during sleep. They believed these bridges were strongest during times of crisis or great change, when people's emotional energy was most intense. The Chinese also developed practical applications for shared dreaming. They believed that generals could share tactical information with their troops through dreams, that healers could diagnose patients by entering their dream space, and that scholars could access collective knowledge by connecting with other learned minds during sleep. Traditional Chinese medicine includes specific treatments for dream disorders, conditions where people were either unable to access shared dreams when they needed to, or were involuntarily pulled into other people's dreams. They used acupuncture, herbal remedies, and meditation techniques to regulate what they called nocturnal qi flow. The Greeks, being Greeks, had multiple theories about shared dreaming. Some thought shared dreams were proof that all human consciousness was connected to a universal mind, a concept that would later influence Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious. Other Greek philosophers believed shared dreams were side effects of the gods getting bored and messing with mortals for entertainment. They had specific myths about Morpheus, the god of dreams, who would sometimes create shared dream experiences just to see how humans would react. The Greeks basically blamed everything on board deities, which honestly explains a lot about Greek mythology. But the Greeks also had more sophisticated theories. Plato wrote about the possibility that individual minds were just fragments of a larger universal consciousness, and that dreams were moments when these fragments could reconnect with the whole. Aristotle was more skeptical, proposing that apparent shared dreams were actually just coincidences that people interpreted as supernatural connections. The Greeks developed the concept of dream incubation, deliberately sleeping in sacred places to receive divine dreams. They built temples specifically for this purpose, where people would sleep hoping to receive healing visions or prophetic dreams. Sometimes entire groups would sleep in these temples and report similar dreams, which the Greeks interpreted as divine messages. Medieval Christians had perhaps the most paranoid interpretation of shared dreaming. They thought shared dreams were either divine visions from God or temptations from the devil. The Church actually had specific procedures for investigating cases of collective dreaming, treating it as a potential supernatural phenomenon that needed to be carefully evaluated. If multiple people in a community had the same dream, Church officials would interview them separately, looking for inconsistencies. If the stories matched too perfectly, they assumed demonic influence. The devil was apparently such a good storyteller that he could create identical false visions. If they were slightly different, they might consider divine origin, because God's truth was apparently inconsistent enough to seem authentic. No winning with the medieval Church, apparently. The Church developed elaborate classification systems for different types of shared dreams. Prophetic dreams were from God and should be taken seriously. Demonic dreams were from Satan and should be ignored or countered with prayer. Natural dreams were just psychological phenomena and had no spiritual significance. They also believed that certain saints and mystics could deliberately enter other people's dreams to provide spiritual guidance. This was considered a holy gift, but it was also dangerous because it could be mimicked by demons trying to lead souls astray. Medieval monasteries kept detailed records of shared dreams among their communities, often interpreting them as signs of divine favor or warnings of spiritual danger. The monks developed sophisticated techniques for distinguishing between different types of shared dreams based on their content, emotional tone, and practical consequences. Modern science has some interesting thoughts on all this, though honestly, we're still just scratching the surface of understanding consciousness and sleep. The scientific revolution brought more skeptical approaches to shared dreaming, but it also brought new tools for studying the phenomenon. Some researchers think shared dreaming might be related to what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, a shared pool of human experiences and archetypes that we all tap into during sleep. Jung proposed that certain symbols, stories, and experiences are universal to human consciousness, and that dreams are one way we access this shared psychological heritage. Jung basically proposed that we're all connected to the same cosmic Wi-Fi network, but only when we're unconscious, which would explain why my dreams are so weird. I'm getting everyone else's mixed signals. Jung's theory suggests that shared dreams aren't necessarily supernatural phenomena, but rather evidence of deeper psychological connections between human minds. He believed that under certain conditions, stress, isolation, intense emotion, individual consciousness could merge with collective psychological patterns. Other scientists focus on environmental factors that might influence dream patterns. They point out that many cases of shared dreaming occur during times of stress, natural disasters, or social upheaval. Maybe extreme circumstances somehow synchronize our brain patterns, creating similar neural activity that produces similar dreams. There's also fascinating research on electromagnetic fields in sleep. Some studies suggest that certain geological locations might influence dream patterns through subtle electromagnetic effects on the brain. This could explain why some places, like monasteries, battlefields, or hospitals, seem to be hotspots for shared dreaming experiences. The pineal gland, sometimes called the third eye, has been studied extensively in relation to dreams and consciousness. Some researchers propose that this small brain structure might be sensitive to electromagnetic fields in ways that could. facilitate shared dreaming experiences. Circadian rhythm research has revealed that sleep patterns are influenced by environmental factors like light, temperature, and even cosmic radiation. It's possible that shared dreaming occurs when groups of people experience synchronized circadian rhythms due to shared environmental conditions. The really interesting modern cases involve twins separated at birth who report having similar dreams throughout their lives. Scientists have documented identical twins who, despite being raised in different countries, dream about the same places, people, and events with remarkable consistency. Genetics apparently comes with a shared dream subscription service. These twin studies suggest that shared dreaming might have a biological component, that genetic similarity could create similar brain patterns that produce similar dreams. But this doesn't explain cases where unrelated people share dreams, or where shared dreams contain accurate information about future events. Quantum physics has introduced some intriguing possibilities for explaining shared dreaming. Some researchers propose that consciousness might operate according to quantum principles, where individual minds could become entangled in ways that allow for information sharing across space and time. The concept of quantum consciousness suggests that the brain might function as a quantum computer, processing information in ways that transcend classical physics. If this is true, then shared dreaming might be evidence of quantum entanglement between human minds. Neuroscience has revealed that dreaming involves complex interactions between different brain regions, including areas responsible for memory, emotion, and sensory processing. Some researchers propose that under certain conditions, these neural networks might synchronize between different individuals, creating shared dream experiences. Mirror neuron research has shown that humans have brain cells that fire both when performing an action and when observing others perform the same action. Some scientists speculate that similar mechanisms might operate during sleep, allowing people to share dream experiences through neural mirroring. Of course, skeptics argue that most cases of shared dreaming can be explained by coincidence, suggestion, or people unconsciously influencing each other's reports. They point out that human memory is notoriously unreliable, and that people might unconsciously modify their dream reports to match others' accounts. Sometimes the most honest answer is, we have no idea what's going on, but it's really interesting. The confirmation bias argument suggests that people pay more attention to similarities in their dreams while ignoring differences, creating an illusion of shared experience. The power of suggestion could also cause people to dream about things they've heard others describe, leading to apparent shared dreams that are actually just psychological influence. But then you have the documented examples, like the Titanic predictions, the Chicago fire premonitions, or the Crimean War visions, where multiple people with no connection to each other described specific details that later proved accurate. These cases are harder to explain away with conventional psychology. Sleep research has revealed that REM sleep, when most vivid dreams occur, involves unique brainwave patterns that might be more susceptible to external influence. Some researchers propose that electromagnetic fields, infrasound, or other environmental factors might synchronize REM sleep patterns between individuals, creating opportunities for shared dreaming. The study of lucid dreaming, where people become conscious during dreams and can control their dream content, has revealed that consciousness during sleep is more flexible and malleable than previously thought. Some lucid dreamers report being able to interact with other people in their dreams, suggesting that shared dream spaces might be accessible to conscious exploration. Modern technology has introduced new possibilities for studying shared dreaming. EE machines can monitor brain activity during sleep, potentially identifying neural patterns associated with shared dream experiences. Virtual reality technology might even allow researchers to create artificial shared dream environments for controlled study. The internet age has made it easier to collect and analyze reports of shared dreaming from around the world. Online communities allow people to share their dream experiences instantly, creating databases of potential shared dream events that researchers can study for patterns. But perhaps the most important thing modern science has taught us is humility about the limits of our understanding. Consciousness remains one of the greatest mysteries in science, and dreams are among the most complex and poorly understood aspects of consciousness. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between ancient wisdom and modern skepticism. Maybe our minds are more connected than we think, but only under specific circumstances. Maybe shared dreaming is just one of those human mysteries we're not ready to understand yet, like a preview of how consciousness might work in ways we haven't discovered. The cross-cultural consistency of shared dreaming reports suggests that it's a genuine human phenomenon, not just a cultural artifact. People from completely different backgrounds, time periods, and belief systems report remarkably similar experiences of shared dreaming, suggesting that it might be a fundamental aspect of human consciousness. Sometimes the most honest answer is that we live in a universe far stranger than we pretend to understand. The study of shared dreaming continues to evolve, with researchers from psychology, neuroscience, physics, and anthropology all contributing different perspectives. As our understanding of consciousness, quantum mechanics, and human connection deepens, we may eventually develop better explanations for these mysterious experiences. Until then, shared dreaming remains a fascinating bridge between scientific inquiry and human mystery, a phenomenon that challenges our assumptions about individual consciousness while reminding us that the boundaries between minds might be more fluid than we imagine. Before we drift off for the night, let me share a few lesser-known stories about shared dreaming that almost nobody talks about. These are the cases that fell through the cracks of history, the ones that are too strange for textbooks but too well documented to ignore. The clockmaker's dream, 1688. There's this obscure record from a London clockmaker named Samuel Wright who documented something extraordinary. For 6 months, every customer who brought in a broken timepiece had the same dream the night before. They dreamed their clock was running backward and time was undoing itself. Wright kept detailed notes because he thought it was a remarkable coincidence. His shop ledger, preserved in the clockmaker's company archives, shows that between September 1688 and March 1689, 43 different customers reported identical dreams about their broken clocks. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell brought in a mantel clock with a broken spring. Wright wrote, "She told me she dreamed the night before that she watched the clock's hands spinning backward, undoing the hours she'd lived through that day. She said she could see her morning tea growing cold in reverse, her breakfast returning to its raw ingredients, her husband's goodbye kiss being pulled back into silence." But then he realized something unsettling. Every clock that appeared in these dreams was broken in exactly the same way as the real one. Customers would describe the exact sound their clock made, the precise way the hands moved wrong, details they shouldn't have known until they brought it to him. Wright's most detailed case involved Thomas Brennan, a merchant who brought in a pocket watch that had stopped working. Mr. Brennan described a dream where he watched his pocket watch running backward through an entire day, Wright recorded. He said he could see the watch face showing time moving in reverse, but more disturbing was that he could see his own life running backward with it. Conversations unhappening, meals being uneaten, steps being unwalked. Time apparently has its own way of announcing when it's broken. The really unsettling part was that Brennan had described the exact internal mechanism failure before Wright opened the watch. He told me the main spring had snapped near the third coil and that there would be a small piece of metal lodged near the escapement, Wright wrote. When I opened the watch, I found precisely what he had described, though he had no knowledge of clockwork mechanisms. Wright began testing his customers, asking them to describe their dreams before examining their timepieces. In 37 out of 43 cases, the customers' dream descriptions matched the actual mechanical problems with impossible accuracy. Mrs. Catherine Morrison dreamed about a grandfather clock where the pendulum was swinging in slow motion, like it was moving through thick honey, Wright recorded. She said she could see tiny gears inside the clock that were covered in a golden substance that made them stick together. When I examined her clock, I found that the mechanism had been contaminated with dried honey, presumably from a kitchen accident she'd never mentioned. The dreams weren't just diagnostic. They were somehow educational. Customers would wake up with understanding of clock repair techniques they'd never learned. Wright's notes described people who could suddenly explain the function of escapements, mainsprings, and gear trains despite having no mechanical training. Wright never figured out why this phenomenon occurred, but he noted that it stopped abruptly when he fixed the last clock. As if the dreams were somehow connected to the actual broken timepieces, reaching out to their owners in sleep. His final entry about the phenomenon reads, "I have repaired the last of the dreaming clocks, and the customers no longer report their strange visions. It is as if time itself was calling out for healing, using the dreams of clock owners to guide them to my shop. Now that all the timepieces are whole again, time sleeps peacefully." The Cartographer's Island 1734. A French cartographer named Henry Dubois documented reports from sailors across the Atlantic who claimed to dream about the same non-existent island. They described it in perfect detail: white beaches, a single mountain, birds that sang in harmonies. Dubois worked for the French Maritime Authority and was responsible for updating navigation charts based on sailors' reports. Between 1734 and 1739, he collected over 60 testimonies from sailors who claimed to have dreamed about an island that didn't appear on any existing maps. Captain Jean-Baptiste Rousseau of the merchant vessel Marie Claire reported dreaming of an island approximately 15 leagues southwest of the Azores. Dubois wrote in his official report. He described beaches of white sand so pure it looked like powdered pearls, a single mountain that rose from the island's center like a sleeping giant, and birds whose songs created harmonies more beautiful than any cathedral choir. What made this extraordinary was that over 40 different sailors, from different ships and different years, drew maps of this island. The maps were identical. Same coastline, same mountain placement, same everything. Dubois's collection includes hand-drawn maps from English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch sailors, all depicting the same island with remarkable consistency. The sailors drew the same curved bay on the eastern shore, the same rocky outcropping on the northern coast, the same small freshwater lake at the mountain's base, Dubois documented. The island had distinctive features that all the dreamers described identically: a beach where the sand was white as snow, a mountain with a perfectly conical shape, and birds that were unlike any known species. The sailors described the birds as being brilliant blue with golden crests, and they said the birds' songs were so beautiful they could heal heartbreak. Captain Miguel Santos of the Portuguese vessel Santa Maria wept when he described the birds' songs. Dubois wrote, "He said they sang in perfect harmony, with each bird contributing a different note to create music that seemed to come from heaven itself. He claimed that hearing their songs in his dream cured him of the grief he'd carried since his wife's death. The dreams weren't just about the island's physical appearance. They included detailed information about its flora, fauna, and even its climate. Sailors described specific plants, the taste of its fresh water, and the exact temperature of its beaches. The island's water tastes like liquid starlight," reported English sailor William Thornton. "Sweet and pure, but with a quality that seems to wash away not just thirst, but weariness of the soul. The fruits that grow there are unlike anything in the known world. They taste like concentrated sunshine and leave, you feeling as if you've been blessed by angels." Dubois spent 5 years trying to find this island, sailing to the exact coordinates multiple sailors had specified in their dreams. He made 4 separate expeditions using the most advanced navigation equipment of his time, but he never found it. "I have searched the waters where the dreamers placed this island," Dubois wrote in his final report. "I have used compass and sextant, have calculated positions based on star charts and ocean currents. The coordinates are precise, the descriptions are consistent, yet the island remains invisible to waking eyes. Sometimes the most beautiful places exist only in our collective imagination, but Dubois never stopped believing it existed somewhere, somehow. His personal journals, discovered in 1892, reveal that he continued having dreams about the island for the rest of his life. He described walking its beaches, climbing its mountain, and listening to the birds' healing songs. "I have come to believe that the island exists in a realm adjacent to our own," Dubois wrote in his private journal. "Perhaps it is a place where souls go to rest between lives, or perhaps it is a paradise that exists only for those who have suffered enough to deserve its peace. The sailors who dream of it are not imagining, they are remembering. The painter's color, 1823, an Italian painter named Giuseppe Morandi discovered that several of his students were dreaming in a color that didn't exist. They'd wake up trying to describe this impossible shade, not blue, not green, not purple, but something that contained all three and none of them. Morandi taught painting at the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence and was known for his innovative color theories. In the spring of 1823, three of his students, Marco Dellacroix, Elena Rossini, and Antonio Salvatore, began reporting dreams filled with a color they couldn't name or reproduce. The students would come to class in the morning, agitated and frustrated, Morandi wrote in his teaching journal. They would describe dreams where entire landscapes were painted in this impossible color, but when they tried to mix pigments to recreate it, they could never achieve the exact shade they'd seen in their sleep. The students' descriptions were remarkably consistent. They said the color was alive, shifting and breathing like a living thing. It had the depth of blue, the vibrancy of green, and the richness of purple, but it was somehow more than the sum of these parts. Marco described it as the color of a mermaid's tears and the shade of moonlight on deep water. Morandi recorded, Elena said it was like looking into the heart of an emerald while standing under a midnight sky. Antonio claimed it was the color of music made visible if music could be painted. Morandi became obsessed with recreating this dream color. He spent months mixing pigments, trying every combination he could think of. His studio became a laboratory where he experimented with traditional paints, exotic dyes, and even ground gemstones. I have tried combinations of lapis, lazuli, and malachite, indigo, and verdigris, ultramarine and copper carbonate, Morandi wrote. I have mixed crushed sapphires with powdered jade, combined peacock feathers with butterfly wings. Nothing produces the color my students describe. The strange part is that Morandi eventually started having the same dreams. He saw the impossible color, and he understood why his students couldn't describe it. It wasn't just a color, it was somehow alive, shifting and breathing like a living thing. His dream journal, discovered in his studio after his death, describes the color in mystical terms. It is the color of the space between heartbeats, the shade of silence before dawn, the hue of the moment when a soul recognizes its reflection in another soul. Some dreams show us things that reality isn't ready to contain. He never succeeded in mixing the perfect shade, but his attempts created some of the most beautiful paintings of the 19th century. Museums still display his impossible color series, though nobody knows they were inspired by shared dreams about something that might not exist. Morandi's paintings from this period show a unique quality that art historians call luminous depth. The colors seem to glow from within, creating an emotional impact that goes beyond visual beauty. Critics of the time wrote that looking at Morandi's paintings induced feelings of profound peace and spiritual transcendence. Professor Morandi's latest works possess a quality that defies description, wrote art critic Francesco Benedetti in 1825. The colors seem to vibrate with life, creating an emotional resonance that speaks directly to the soul. I find myself returning to his paintings again and again, seeking something I cannot name but somehow recognize. The impossible color dreams stopped as suddenly as they had begun, but they left a lasting impact on Morandi and his students. All four went on to become renowned artists, and their work consistently displayed an unusual understanding of color relationships that their contemporaries couldn't match. Elena Rossini's later paintings included color combinations that shouldn't work according to traditional theory, but created stunning visual effects. Marco Dellacroix developed a technique for layering transparent colors that created depth and luminosity no other artist could achieve. Antonio Salvatore became famous for portraits that captured not just people's appearance, but somehow their essential spiritual nature. Morandi himself continued to paint for another 30 years, but he never forgot the impossible color from his dreams. His final painting, completed just before his death in 1853, was a simple canvas covered in layers of blue, green, and purple pigments applied so carefully that they seemed to shimmer and move in the light. Art historians call this final painting the color of dreams, and it remains one of the most emotionally powerful works in the Uffizi Gallery. Visitors report that looking at it induces feelings of profound nostalgia for something they can't remember, as if the painting reminds them of a place they've never been, but somehow know they've lost. Sometimes I wonder if the people in these stories ever realized how their dreams would fascinate strangers, hundreds of years later. There's something kind of beautiful about that, isn't there? That our most private experiences, our dreams, can somehow connect us across centuries. Dreams are the ultimate time capsules, carrying messages between minds across impossible distances. If you're somehow still awake right now, which would honestly surprise me, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a dream that felt too specific, too detailed to be just your imagination? Ever wake up feeling like you shared that experience with someone, somewhere? And hey, if you've enjoyed drifting off to these strange stories about minds connecting across time and space, don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back next week with another journey through history's weirdest dream experiences. Maybe tonight you'll dream about something we talked about. Maybe you'll find yourself in that impossible library from the London Blitz, or walking through that island that only exists in sailors' dreams. Who knows? Maybe while you're sleeping, your mind will brush against someone else's, somewhere in the world, and you'll share a moment that defies explanation. Sleep tight, and remember, you're never really dreaming alone. See you in your dreams.